Long before the world knew the echoes of modern battles, when the air hummed with the ancient songs of the wind, there lived a people who carried the fire of their ancestors in their bones. Their warriors were legends, their spirits untamed. The Celts, with their fierce pride and boundless courage, roamed the dense forests and mist-covered hills, where the line between life and death was a whisper, and every footstep was a vow to the gods of war. It wasn't just their swords that made the Celts feared. It was the stories they lived, carved into their very souls. Their warriors were not born from the flesh alone, they were forged in the heat of myth and sacrifice. From the moment a child could walk, the warriors knew what they would become, a symbol of strength, a force of nature. But the true heart of their power lay not just in their physical might, but in the bond they shared with the land itself. The ancient lands that gave birth to the Celts were wild, untamed places, where the sky stretched out endlessly, and the earth seemed to pulse with life. These warriors did not just walk upon the earth, they were of it. The wind spoke to them, the trees whispered their secrets, and the rivers carried the blood of their ancestors in their currents. To be a warrior was to be a part of the land's very spirit. As young men, they learned the ways of the sword, the shield, and the spear, but more importantly, they learned the ways of the gods. The Celts didn't fight for kings, they fought for something greater. They fought for honor, for the gods, for the earth beneath their feet, and for the eternal cycle of life and death that connected them to the stars. But it wasn't enough to simply hold a weapon in your hand. To be a true Celtic warrior, one had to prove oneself worthy of the gods' favor. The rituals were many, dangerous, bloody, and sacred. Every warrior had to face the trials that tested their strength, their courage, and their very soul. Some would come back with scars that told of their victories, while others would return with nothing but the cold silence of defeat. But each trial was a step closer to becoming something more than human, something that would live on in the stories of their people for centuries to come. The gods were ever watchful. The mighty warrior Cuchulainn, whose name would echo through the ages, was not born of mortal blood alone. His strength was a gift from the gods themselves. He was a warrior whose mere name struck fear into the hearts of those who heard it, a man who could wield a spear with such power that the very earth seemed to tremble beneath its blow. Yet, even he knew that the power he held was borrowed, and he carried the weight of that knowledge like an unspoken promise. But not all of the gods looked upon the warriors with favor. The Morrigan, the goddess of war and fate, was both a blessing and a curse. She could appear as a crow, circling above the battlefield, her sharp eyes seeing the end before it came. She was the whisper of death on the wind, and her favor was a double-edged sword. A warrior who had earned her blessing would find themselves victorious, but at what cost? The gods were fickle, and even the mightiest of warriors could fall under their shadow. It wasn't just the gods who shaped these warriors. It was the land itself, the earth that gave them life and the soil that stained their hands with blood. The Celts saw themselves as a part of something larger, something ancient. The warriors stood in the great circle of life and death, where each victory was both a triumph and a sacrifice, and each defeat was a chance to be reborn in the afterlife. They believed that their souls were immortal, passing from one life to the next in an endless cycle, their stories carried on the wings of the wind. But it wasn't only the greatest of warriors who were remembered. Every warrior, from the mightiest king to the humblest soldier, had their part to play. The names of these warriors, their battles, their victories, and their defeats would be etched into the stones of the land, whispered in the wind, and sung by bards around the fire. Every story, no matter how small, contributed to the grand tapestry of their people's legacy. The Celtic warriors didn't just fight to protect their homes, they fought to protect their very way of life. When their enemies came, they didn't see invaders, they saw threats to the sacred bond between the gods and the land. Their battles were not just about survival, they were about preserving the stories, the songs, and the rituals that made them who they were. In every clash of steel, in every battle cry, the Celts were reminded of the power they held in their hearts, the power to shape the world around them, to bend the gods to their will, and to become immortal through the stories of their deeds. The origins of the Celts and their warriors lie not in the annals of history, but in the beating hearts of those who dared to fight with the fury of the storm and the strength of the earth. It was in the blood of kings and the hands of warriors that the true legacy of the Celts was forged, a legacy that would live on in the whispers of the trees, in the roar of the battle cry, and in the souls of the warriors who dared to stand and fight for the honor of the gods. There was a time when the gods walked among the Celts, their presence felt in every gust of wind and flicker of fire. The warriors would march to battle not just for glory, but in the name of these powerful beings, whose favor could turn the tide of war. In the heartbeat of every warrior, the gods of war thudded, urging them onward, whispering promises of victory or warning of doom. The battlefields were alive with divine power, where mortal swords clashed against the forces of fate, and the gods themselves would watch, sometimes guiding, sometimes deciding the fate of those who fought. The gods were more than just figures in distant myths. They were ever-present, tangible, and inextricably woven into the fabric of every warrior's soul. At the center of it all was the Morrigan, the goddess of war and fate. Her name was spoken in hushed tones, as if saying it aloud could summon her dark presence. She was not a goddess of mercy. No, she was the harbinger of battle, the one who determined who would live and who would die. She took the form of a raven, black feathers rippling in the wind as she circled overhead. To see her was a sign of war, a sign of death. Her eyes saw beyond the mortal realm, knowing the destiny of every warrior before they even raised their sword. The warriors who earned her favor became unstoppable forces on the battlefield. But it was never a gift without a price. The Morrigan was capricious. She might bless you with strength in one moment, only to curse you with defeat in the next. She was both a protector and a destroyer. Her whispers could raise the spirit of a dying warrior or deliver them to the otherworld with a final breath. And in the end, no matter how fierce, every warrior would eventually meet her, for death was the only certainty in her domain. Then there was Lugh, the shining god of light and skill, whose very name meant brightness. He was the bringer of victory, the god that every warrior prayed to before a battle. His spear, the Giasail, was said to be so powerful that it could pierce the heart of the mightiest enemy. Lugh was a god of many talents, craft, wisdom, and leadership, but it was his role as a warrior god that stirred the hearts of the Celtic people. He led the Tuatha Dé Danann to victory at the Battle of Mag Tuired, a battle that would be remembered forever. When Lugh called upon his people, his voice was not just a command, it was the call of destiny itself. Yet, Lugh was not an invincible god. He, too, faced his own trials and battles, proving that even the gods of war were not immune to hardship. He understood that the true power of a warrior lay not in their weapons alone, but in their courage, their heart, and their unshakable will. In the darkest moments of war, when hope seemed lost, it was Lugh's light that guided the warriors through the storm, a shining beacon that no enemy could snuff out. And then, there was the great Cernunnos, the horned god of fertility and the hunt. Though not always associated with war in the traditional sense, his influence on the battlefield was undeniable. He was the protector of the wilds, the god who governed the forests and the beasts. In times of war, his warriors called upon him for strength, for the endurance to survive when everything seemed stacked against them. His power lay in the earth itself, the soil, the trees, and the animals that roamed free. His was a quiet strength, but it was no less fierce than that of any battle-hardened god. Cernunnos was a reminder that war was not just about bloodshed and victory, it was about balance. The hunter needed the hunted, the warrior needed the land. Without one, the other would perish. It was a lesson that the Celtic warriors held in their hearts as they fought, knowing that their victories and their losses were part of a greater cycle. They didn't fight for war's sake alone, they fought to honor the gods and the land that had given them life. But not all gods were as distant as the Morrigan or as mighty as Lugh. There was Brigid, the goddess of healing, poetry, and fire. She was the nurturer, the one who kept the flame of life burning even in the darkest of times. In the aftermath of battle, when the warriors were broken and bloodied, it was Brigid who tended to their wounds, whispered words of comfort, and helped them find the strength to rise again. Her power was the balm to the wounds of war, a reminder that even in the face of destruction, there was hope, there was healing. Brigid's presence was felt in every hearth and every healing lodge, where warriors would seek solace and strength, preparing for the next battle to come. These gods, and many more, were not just figures in stories, they were the very essence of the warriors they watched over. Every battle, every victory, and every defeat was a reflection of the gods' will. The Celts understood this intimately. They fought not just for themselves, but for the honor of the gods who had given them strength. They knew that the gods were always watching, guiding them, testing them. And when the battle was over, when the dust settled and the blood soaked into the earth, the gods were there, too, waiting to claim their warriors, whether in victory or death. The gods of war were not simply deities to be feared or revered. They were companions, allies, and adversaries. They were the very breath that filled the warriors' lungs and the fire that burned in their hearts. In the moment of battle, when all else faded away, the warriors could feel the gods' presence as if they were standing beside them, their power flowing through their veins, urging them to fight on, to give everything. The gods were the unseen force that shaped the fate of every warrior, the invisible hands that guided the swords and shields, the voices that echoed in the minds of the brave. To be a Celtic warrior was to live in the shadow of these gods, knowing that every victory was a blessing, and every defeat was a message from the divine. The night was thick with mist, the kind that clung to the skin and whispered ancient truths into the silence. Somewhere in the distance, a single flame flickered, a signal, a warning, or perhaps a tribute. In this world, where gods and men walked side by side, heroes were not born, they were carved from the raw stone of fate, their edges sharpened by sacrifice, their hearts forged in the fire of unyielding trials. These were the figures who defied death, stared down destiny, and became legends that would echo for eternity. Cu Chulainn was a name that stirred the blood. He was not an ordinary man, for ordinary men did not hold the strength of 100 warriors or wield weapons that seemed to hunger for battle. His birth alone was a tale of omens and otherworldly promises. Born as Setanta, his path to greatness began not in glory but in an act of fierce loyalty and raw determination. One evening, when a fierce hound threatened his life, Setanta took its life with nothing more than a hurled ball. Yet, what came next cemented his destiny. To atone for the death of the beast, he vowed to serve as its replacement, becoming the guardian of the land. From that day on, he was no longer Setanta. He became Cu Chulainn, the Hound of Ulster. It was said that in battle, his body would twist into unnatural forms, his hair ablaze, his eyes wild with the fury of war. This transformation, the Ryostrad, turned him into a force of nature, unstoppable and terrifying. Warriors who dared to face him often spoke of a cold dread that gripped their hearts, for they knew they were not fighting a man but a legend. Yet beneath the blood and fire, there was a heart burdened with the weight of his deeds. Even the mightiest hero could not escape the cost of their own greatness. Then there was Finn Mac Cumhaill, the wise and mighty leader of the Fianna. His story began not in a blaze of triumph, but in shadows, hunted as a child after the death of his father. Finn grew up in the wilderness, learning the secrets of the land, mastering the arts of war and survival. His greatest gift, however, was not his sword but his wisdom. One fateful day, he tasted the salmon of knowledge, a creature that held all the wisdom of the world. From that moment on, his mind became a weapon sharper than any blade. Finn's Fianna were not merely warriors, they were poets, dreamers, and guardians of Ireland. Together, they fought battles that would leave the earth trembling and the skies roaring. But Finn himself was a figure of contrasts, his strength matched by his tenderness, his brilliance shadowed by his struggles. The love he bore for his people was both his greatest strength and his deepest vulnerability. Yet, not all heroes were warriors of might. Deirdre, the most beautiful woman in all of Ireland, was a figure whose story was painted in shades of tragedy and love. Her beauty was so great that it was prophesied to bring both joy and sorrow. When King Conchobar claimed her as his own, she defied him, fleeing with her true love, Nawaz. Their love was fierce, unyielding, and destined to end in heartbreak. Betrayed by those they trusted, Nawaz was slain, and Deirdre, unable to bear the weight of her loss, took her own life. Her story was not one of battles won or enemies slain, but it burned just as brightly in the hearts of the Celtic people. Deirdre's love and defiance became a symbol of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, one could still choose their own path, even if it led to sorrow. The stories of heroes were not always stories of triumph. They were stories of sacrifice, of lives given for something greater than themselves. Tainbwakweonj, the great cattle raid of Cooley, was one such tale. It was not just a tale of warriors clashing, but of pride, ambition, and the weight of decisions. Queen Medb of Connaught sought to claim the great bull of Ulster, a symbol of power and wealth. But standing in her way was Cuchulainn, alone against an army. Day after day, Cuchulainn fought, his hands blistered, his body broken, but his spirit unyielding. Each battle was more brutal than the last, and yet he stood, not for glory, but because it was his duty. The warriors who faced him fell not only to his skill, but to the sheer force of his will. Heroes like Skathach, the warrior woman who trained Cuchulainn, were legends in their own right. Her shadowy figure loomed over the stories of those she had taught, a reminder that even the greatest needed guidance. It was Skathach who taught Cuchulainn the Gibolb, the deadly spear that no enemy could survive. She was a master of combat, a teacher of legends, and a figure whose own deeds were woven into the very fabric of Celtic lore. In the end, the heroes of Celtic mythology were not defined by their victories alone, but by the strength of their hearts and the depth of their sacrifices. They were figures who stood between the mortal world and the divine, carrying the weight of their people's hopes and fears. Their stories were told around fires, whispered in the wind, and etched into the soul of the land itself. Every sword raised, every tear shed, and every life given in their name became a part of a tale that would never fade. These legends were not just tales of the past, they were the lifeblood of a people who believed that true heroism was not in never falling but in rising again, no matter the odds. And so, the heroes of Celtic lore lived on, their names carried like a battle cry, a reminder that courage, sacrifice, and love are the forces that shape both men and gods. The ground trembled beneath the stampede of feet, each step a promise of glory or doom. The sun cast its fiery gaze over the field, its light glinting off swords, spears, and shields. The air was thick with the smell of earth and sweat, and in that charged silence before the first battle cry, there was a force stronger than fear. It was honor, binding every warrior like an unbreakable chain to the code they lived and died by. To be a Celtic warrior was to wear your soul on your sword, every strike an expression of who you were. Strength was not just in the body but in the heart. It was the courage to face an enemy, knowing the odds were against you, yet still refusing to yield. A warrior's worth wasn't measured by the battles they won, but by the integrity they carried into each fight. Death was inevitable, but dishonor was unforgivable. The oaths they swore were sacred, the lifeblood of their identity. Once given, a word was never broken. To fail an oath was to fail the gods, the ancestors, and every soul who ever stood by your side. The bond between warriors was not forged in words, but in the shared bloodshed of countless battles. A Celtic warrior would rather meet death than turn their back on a comrade. When warriors prepared for battle, it wasn't just a matter of sharpening blades or polishing armor. It was a ritual, a communion with the spirits of those who had fought before them. They painted their bodies with blue woad, the patterns not just marks of intimidation, but symbols of power, blessings from the gods to protect and guide them. Each line told a story, each stroke a reminder of their purpose. The roar of battle was never chaotic. Beneath the ferocity was a strategy as sharp as the blades they wielded. Celtic warriors understood the importance of unity. Their warbands moved like a single organism, each warrior's actions flowing seamlessly into the next. Leaders stood at the front, not barking orders from the rear, but fighting alongside their men, earning respect through action. Their strategies were born not in halls of learning but on the battlefield, shaped by the land and the people they fought for. They used the terrain to their advantage, luring enemies into forests where the trees became allies, or onto narrow passes where numbers meant nothing. The Celts were masters of the ambush, their attacks swift and deadly, leaving their enemies no time to react. But even in the heat of battle, there were rules, unspoken, yet unbreakable. Killing a defenseless enemy was a stain no warrior could wash away. Mercy was not weakness, it was strength, a mark of control in a world ruled by chaos. To grant an enemy a chance to fight another day was to honor the gods, who watched every move with eyes that saw beyond the battlefield. The bond between warriors extended beyond their own kind. They fought with a respect for their enemies, knowing that those who stood against them were bound by their own codes and beliefs. After the battle, the dead were honored, their bravery acknowledged, whether friend or foe. It was a way of life that understood the value of humanity even amidst the brutality of war. Strength was not just physical but mental. The weight of battle was as much a test of endurance as it was a display of skill. Every swing of the sword carried the weight of the warrior's fears, hopes, and dreams. And yet, they fought on, driven by a code that left no room for doubt. There was no retreat, no surrender. To fight was to live with purpose, to fall was to die with honor. And still, there were moments when the chaos of war faded, and something greater shone through. The sound of a war horn splitting the air, the sight of a leader raising their sword in defiance against insurmountable odds, these were the moments when the spirit of the Celtic warrior came alive. They were not fighting for gold or power. They fought for their clans, their families, their gods, and the land that had birthed them. The strength of a Celtic warrior was a reflection of the strength of their people. They carried their entire world with them into battle, the laughter of children, the wisdom of elders, the love of those waiting for them at home. Every strike of their blade was a promise to protect what they held most dear. And when a warrior fell, it was not the end. Their name would be spoken around fires, their deeds sung in songs that would outlast the battles themselves. To die in battle was not a tragedy but a triumph, a fulfillment of their sacred duty. The land would remember them, the gods would welcome them, and their spirit would live on in the hearts of those who followed. The Celtic warrior code was not just a set of rules but a way of being, a path that demanded everything but gave back something greater. It was the rhythm of life and death, the pulse of honor and strength that echoed through the veins of every warrior. And as the sun set on the battlefield, painting the earth with shadows and blood, the warriors who stood and those who fell became one with the code they had lived and fought for. The battlefield was silent, but for the whisper of the wind, heavy with the scent of blood and smoke. Broken shields and shattered swords lay scattered like forgotten memories. In the center, a single figure moved, cloaked in shadows and the shimmer of something otherworldly. Her hair, dark as a raven's wing, seemed to drink the light around her. Her eyes, fierce and unyielding, held the weight of countless battles, the reflection of lives ended and fates rewritten. She was not a warrior, but the force that guided them, the specter of war itself. She was the Morrigan. The Morrigan did not come with the roar of a charging army or the clash of steel. She came in whispers and the cries of crows circling above. She was the sharp edge of inevitability, the quiet moment when a warrior realized their end was near. To some, she was terror incarnate. To others, she was the comforting shadow that welcomed them home. She walked the line between life and death, her presence a reminder that no one escaped the hand of fate. She was known by many names and faces, but none could mistake her purpose. In her form as a crow, she perched above the chaos, watching as warriors clashed. Her sharp cries were said to signal doom, her wings carrying the weight of death's approach. Yet she did not act without reason. The Morrigan chose her moments carefully, weaving the threads of destiny with a precision that even the gods respected. She appeared to kings and warriors, her words a mix of prophecy and challenge. Those who listened carefully might find a sliver of hope or a path to victory. Those who ignored her warnings often found their names erased from history, swallowed by the silence of defeat. She was not cruel, but neither was she kind. Her loyalty was to the balance, to the unending cycle of life and death that shaped the world. The Morrigan's power was not in brute strength, but in the force of her will. She could twist the minds of even the bravest warriors, filling their hearts with doubt and fear. Yet she could also inspire, igniting a fire within those she deemed worthy. To see her on the battlefield was to know that something greater than mortal conflict was at play. She was a herald of change, the tipping point between chaos and order. Her voice was a haunting melody, laced with the echoes of forgotten battles and the cries of the fallen. When she spoke, the air seemed to still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Her words carried the weight of inevitability, a reminder that every life had its moment, every warrior their time to fall. Yet within her voice was a strange tenderness, a recognition of the pain and beauty in the choices made by those she watched over. Legend spoke of her appearing to Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, in his final days. She came to him not as an enemy but as a mirror, reflecting the path he had walked and the end that awaited him. She offered him visions, both of glory and despair, and in those moments, she was not just a goddess but a storyteller, weaving the tale of a hero who would never be forgotten. The Morrigan was not bound by the rules of men or gods. She moved through the world as a force of nature, her actions as unpredictable as the storm. One moment, she could be a fierce protector, her rage striking down those who threatened the balance. The next, she could be the shadow that tore alliances apart, her whispers turning friends into enemies. To the Celts, she was more than a goddess of war. She was a guardian of fate, a reminder that every choice mattered, every action carried weight. She did not judge, but she watched, her piercing gaze seeing beyond the surface to the truth beneath. Warriors feared her, but they also revered her, for they knew that without her, the chaos of battle would have no meaning. In the quiet after a battle, when the cries had faded and the earth lay heavy with sorrow, the Morrigan remained. She walked among the fallen, her touch as gentle as the wind, her presence a balm to the restless souls who lingered. She carried them to the other side, her voice a lullaby that soothed even the fiercest spirits. Yet she was not untouched by the weight of her role. The Morrigan bore the scars of every life she had witnessed, every death she had guided. In the rare moments when she stood alone, her form seemed less fierce, her eyes holding a glimmer of something deeper, an understanding of the pain and beauty in the cycle she upheld. To see her was to stand at the edge of eternity, to feel the pull of forces beyond comprehension. The Morrigan was not simply a figure of death, but a symbol of the choices that defined life. She reminded those who walked the path of warriors that their lives were part of a greater story, one that would echo long after the last sword had fallen. And so she moved through the world, her presence a shadow over every battlefield, her name whispered in awe and fear. The Morrigan, goddess of war and fate, was not bound by the laws of gods or men. She was the force that shaped them, the hand that turned the wheel of destiny, the voice that called warriors home. The wind howled through the frozen peaks, a voice ancient and unyielding, carrying the weight of countless winters. Snow fell like whispers from the heavens, blanketing the earth in silence. And there, amidst the frost-covered stones and jagged cliffs, stood a figure as old as the mountains themselves. Her hair was white as the snow, her eyes cold and piercing, like the icy depths of a winter river. She was the Cailleach, the elder goddess of battle and winter, a force of nature whose presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Her staff, carved from a branch of the oldest tree, struck the ground with a sound that echoed for miles. With each strike, the earth hardened beneath her touch, rivers froze, and the green of life retreated into hiding. She was not cruel, but neither was she merciful. Her power was a reminder that survival was a privilege earned through resilience and strength. Legend spoke of her forging the very landscapes of the Celtic lands, sculpting mountains with her hands and shaping the valleys with her breath. Every peak, every gorge bore the mark of her will, a testament to her indomitable spirit. She walked these lands not as a ruler but as a keeper, ensuring that the balance of the seasons was maintained, that the world would endure its trials to bloom once more. Yet the Cailleach was more than a goddess of winter, she was a harbinger of battle, her icy presence a prelude to strife. Warriors knew her name and feared her touch, for when she appeared, it was said that blood would soon stain the snow. Her voice, low and resonant, carried the weight of prophecy, her words often foretelling the rise and fall of those who dared to take up arms. There was no softness in her, no warmth to soothe the weary. But in her stern gaze was a wisdom so vast it seemed to stretch beyond time itself. She saw the world not as it was but as it could be, and her actions, though harsh, were meant to strengthen, to prepare. The warriors who faced her wrath were tested in ways they could not understand. Those who survived were forever changed, forged anew like steel in the coldest of flames. Some claimed to have seen her on the battlefield, a towering figure cloaked in the mists of winter. Her staff became a weapon, her strikes as swift and unrelenting as the northern winds. She moved like a storm, unstoppable and merciless, her presence enough to freeze the hearts of even the bravest warriors. Yet, for those who stood their ground, who met her icy gaze without faltering, there was a strange glimmer of respect in her eyes. To the Celtic, battle was not just a clash of swords and shields, it was a crucible, a place where souls were tested, where the truth of a person was laid bare. She cared not for the politics of kings or the ambitions of mortals. What mattered to her was the strength of spirit, the ability to endure, to rise even when the odds were insurmountable. In the depths of winter, when the days were short and the nights seemed endless, her presence was felt most keenly. The cold was her breath, the frost her touch, and the unyielding ice her resolve. Villagers would speak her name in hushed tones, their fires burning low as they huddled together for warmth. Some left offerings at the foot of ancient stones, hoping to earn her favor or at least her indifference. But the Celtic was not a goddess swayed by gifts or prayers. She was as constant and unchanging as the mountains she called home. Her lessons were harsh, but they were necessary. She reminded the world that life was fragile, that survival required strength and perseverance. And though she brought hardship, she also brought renewal. For after the bitterest winters came the most vibrant springs, and the land she left behind was stronger, more fertile for the trials it had endured. There were tales of those who tried to challenge her, warriors seeking glory, kings craving control over her dominion. None succeeded. The Celtic could not be defeated, for she was not a being of flesh and blood but the embodiment of winter's essence, the force that shaped and defined the world. Those who fought her met their end quickly, their bodies frozen in the places where they fell, their names forgotten in the biting wind. Yet, not all who encountered her met with death. There were those rare souls who earned her respect, who endured her trials with unwavering resolve. To them, she offered not warmth but a glimmer of understanding. They left her presence forever changed, carrying with them a strength that could not be taught, only earned. The Celtic's legacy was etched into the very fabric of the Celtic world. Her presence was felt in every snowstorm, her power seen in every frost-covered field. She was a goddess of transformation, of endings and beginnings. Her winter was not an end, but a necessary pause, a time for the earth to rest, for the weak to fall away and the strong to rise anew. And though her touch was cold and her gaze unyielding, there was a strange beauty in her. She was the stillness of a frozen lake, the quiet majesty of snow-capped peaks, the fierce grace of a blizzard tearing through the land. To face her was to face the raw, unfiltered power of nature, to feel the fragility of life and the strength it took to endure. The Celtic was a force unlike any other, a goddess who walked alone yet touched the lives of all who lived in her shadow. She was the sculptor of the land, the keeper of winter, the tester of souls. And as the snow fell silently around her, covering the world in a blanket of white, she stood as a reminder that even in the harshest of times, there was purpose, there was strength, and there was beauty. The sky hung heavy with the weight of impending chaos, dark clouds swirling as though the heavens themselves recoiled from the violence that was about to unfold. The ground, wet and soft from the morning's drizzle, seemed to tremble beneath the pounding of countless feet, the earth bracing for the blood it would soon drink. Across the plains of Magtwyred, an eerie stillness fell, the kind that settles only before the first scream of war. On one side stood the Tuatha De Danann, their banners snapping in the wind, their faces fierce with determination. They were not mere mortals, but descendants of gods, wielding weapons imbued with the power of the divine. At their head was Nuada, the silver-handed king, his gaze like tempered steel, his movements deliberate and commanding. Beside him, warriors adorned with shining armor gripped their swords and spears, their knuckles pale against their weapons. They carried more than arms, they bore the hope of their people and the weight of their destiny. Opposing them were the Fir-Bolg, the first settlers of these lands, whose claim to the soil was ancient and deeply rooted. Their warriors stood unyielding, their eyes reflecting the storm brewing above. They were rugged and battle-worn, men who had bled for this land and would gladly bleed again to keep it. Their war cries were guttural and raw, echoing across the field like the growl of a cornered beast. The first clash was not marked by the sound of swords or shields, but by the sharp, deafening call of a horn. It sliced through the air, sending a shiver down the spines of all who heard it. Then, like a wave crashing against the shore, the army surged forward, colliding with a force that shook the very ground beneath them. Swords met shields in a symphony of chaos, the metallic clang of weapons drowned out only by the cries of pain and rage. Warriors fell, their lifeblood soaking into the soil as their comrades pressed on, driven by fury and a desperation to endure. The air grew thick with the acrid scent of sweat and blood, the landscape transforming into a grim tableau of sacrifice. Nuada fought at the forefront, his silver hand gleaming even in the dim light. He moved with a grace that belied his strength, his sword cutting through the air like a streak of lightning. But even as he carved a path through the fur bald, his heart was heavy. This was not a battle of strangers, it was a conflict between two peoples who had once lived side by side. Yet here they were, locked in a brutal struggle, their shared history buried beneath the weight of their blades. The fur bald were relentless, their warriors fighting with the ferocity of those who had nothing to lose. Among them was Shreng, their champion, a towering figure with arms like tree trunks and a presence that seemed to darken the battlefield. His mace was a monstrous weapon, each swing shattering shields and sending men sprawling. When Shreng's eyes met Nuada's, the world seemed to still for a moment, the two leaders staring at one another with a mix of respect and resolve. Their duel was a thing of legend. Shreng's mace came crashing down with the force of an avalanche, but Nuada met it with his sword, the clash sending sparks flying. They circled each other, striking and parrying, neither giving an inch. The battlefield seemed to fade around them as their fight became the center of everything, their movements as fluid and precise as a deadly dance. Then came the moment that would change everything. Shreng's mace found its mark, striking Nuada's arm with such force that the bone shattered, his sword falling from his grasp. The silver-handed king stumbled, his silver limb torn and lifeless at his side. A gasp rippled through the Tuatha De Danann, their unshakable leader brought low by a single, devastating blow. But even in his agony, Nuada did not yield. He stood, blood streaming from his wound, and fixed Shreng with a defiant glare. It was not a look of defeat but of unrelenting will, a reminder that even in their darkest hour, the Tuatha De Danann would not bow. The tide of battle shifted with a fury. Seeing their king injured, the warriors of the Tuatha De Danann fought with renewed vigor, their cries rising above the din of combat. The fur bald, though fierce, began to falter under the unrelenting assault, their lines breaking as the weight of the Tuatha De Danann's determination bore down upon them. In the chaos, the goddess Bridget appeared, her presence a balm to the wounded and weary. Her voice, soft yet unyielding, carried across the field, urging her people to stand strong, to fight not with hatred but with purpose. Her touch brought healing to those who could still fight, her light a beacon in the storm of blood and steel. By the end of the day, the plains of Mag Twyred were soaked in crimson, the bodies of fallen warriors lying where they had made their final stand. The Tuatha De Danann emerged victorious, their claim to the land solidified through sacrifice and struggle. But it was a hollow victory, the cost of their triumph etched into the faces of those who survived. Nuada, though grievously wounded, was carried from the battlefield with a quiet dignity. His people rallied around him, their loyalty unshaken despite his loss. They saw in him not just a king but a symbol of their resilience, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, they could endure. The fur bald, though defeated, were not destroyed. Their spirit remained unbroken, their legacy forever entwined with the land they had fought so fiercely to protect. And as the sun set over Mag Twyred, its light painting the field in shades of gold and red, the echoes of the battle lingered in the air, a haunting melody of courage, sacrifice, and the unyielding will to survive. The firelight flickered across the faces of the gathered warriors, casting long, restless shadows on the walls of the stone chamber. Outside, the wind howled like a mournful spirit, shaking the wooden beams and rattling the iron tools that hung by the door. In the center of the room, an old woman sat cross-legged, her eyes closed, her breath steady and slow. She was wrapped in a tattered cloak, her hair wild and streaked with gray, but it was her voice, low and charged with an almost unbearable weight, that held everyone captive. "The raven circles thrice," she said, her voice breaking the silence like the toll of a distant bell. Blood will stain the earth where the sun rises on the third day. A leader will fall, but the line will not break. The warriors stiffened, their hands tightening around the hilts of their swords. They had asked for her wisdom, sought her sight, and now they trembled before the truths she offered. Prophecy was a blade sharper than any forged in fire. It could cut through certainty, leaving behind only questions, doubts, and a choice. In Celtic warfare, prophecy was not just guidance, it was law. The Druids, keepers of the old ways, often bore the heavy burden of foretelling. They were conduits between the mortal and the divine, their visions respected and feared in equal measure. When they spoke of death, it was not merely an inevitability, it became a certainty, a weight that each warrior carried into battle. For some, prophecy was a comfort. It gave meaning to the chaos of war, a reassurance that their actions were not random, that their sacrifice served a greater purpose. For others, it was a curse, an unyielding fate that could not be avoided, no matter how desperately they fought. The woman in the stone chamber opened her eyes, and they glinted like obsidian in the firelight. "There will be a storm," she continued, her voice rising. "A great darkness will fall over the battlefield, and the air will reek of fear and ash. But in the heart of the storm, a single flame will burn, and from that flame, hope will rise." The youngest warrior, barely more than a boy, shivered despite the warmth of the fire. He had never fought in a great battle, never felt the terror of standing against an enemy who sought to end him. But he knew what the old woman's words meant. He would be tested, and whether he lived or died would depend not on his skill with a blade, but on the will of forces far beyond his understanding. The role of prophecy in Celtic warfare was not limited to predicting victory or defeat. It shaped strategies, influenced alliances, and instilled either courage or despair in the hearts of those who fought. Before a great battle, the Druids would watch the flight of birds, study the patterns of smoke rising from sacred fires, or interpret the dreams of the warriors. Each omen was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of fate that could not be ignored. On the eve of one legendary conflict, it is said that a Druid named Cathbad foretold the death of a great king. "He will stand at the front of his army," Cathbad declared, "and his shield will shine like the sun. But a shadow will pierce him, and he will fall before the first wave breaks." The king, upon hearing this, did not falter. "If I am to fall," he said, "then let it be with my men behind me and my enemies before me. I will not cower in the face of what must be." His words spread through the ranks, igniting a fierce resolve among his warriors. They would fight not for survival, but for honor, for the memory of a leader who had embraced his fate with open arms. When the battle came, the prophecy unfolded exactly as Cathbad had said. The king fell, his shield shattered, but his death became the spark that drove his warriors to victory. They fought with a fury that could not be contained, their cries rising above the clamor of swords and spears. In his sacrifice, the king had become immortal, a figure of legend whose story would be told for generations. But not all prophecies were so noble. Some spoke of betrayal, of brothers turning against brothers, of battles lost not to strength but to treachery. These were the prophecies that sowed doubt and discord, that fractured the unity of even the strongest armies. In one tale, a warrior named Cryanak was warned by a druid that his closest ally would be the cause of his downfall. "Beware the one who rides at your side," the druid said. "His loyalty is as fleeting as the wind." Cryanak, consumed by paranoia, turned against his friend, banishing him from their ranks. But on the battlefield, Cryanak found himself surrounded, and the very ally he had cast out returned, this time as an enemy, leading the charge that would end Cryanak's life. Such was the power of prophecy. It could unite or divide, inspire or destroy. It was a weapon wielded not by warriors, but by those who could see beyond the veil of the present into the uncertain shadows of the future. As the old woman in the stone chamber finished speaking, her gaze swept over the assembled warriors. Some met her eyes with defiance, others with fear, but all of them knew that her words would haunt them when the sun rose and the battle began. She stood, her movements slow but purposeful, and placed a hand on the shoulder of the youngest warrior. "The gods do not choose lightly," she said, her voice softer now. If they have placed you in their vision, it is because they see in you something you may not yet see in yourself. Be strong, child. The fire within you will burn brighter than any storm. The boy nodded, though his hands trembled at his sides. He did not feel strong. He felt like a child pretending to be a man, a flickering flame in a world of roaring fires. But as the old woman's words sank in, he felt something stir within him, a spark of courage, of purpose. Outside, the wind screamed against the stone walls, as if the gods themselves were impatient for the battle to begin. And in the hearts of those who waited, the weight of prophecy settled like a second sword, sharp and unyielding. The battlefield was not always a place of chaos and bloodshed. Before the first war cry shattered the silence, there was a stillness, a solemn, almost sacred pause where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. In this fragile moment, a figure stepped forward, their robes flowing like the rivers of time, their eyes piercing through the veil of what was and what could be. The Druid, neither warrior nor spectator, stood at the center of it all. They held no sword, bore no shield, but their presence was as commanding as the fiercest champion. With a single hand raised, they could summon fire from the heavens or silence an entire army. Their voice, low and steady, carried the weight of ancient truths, and their words struck deeper than any blade. The warriors watched as the Druid approached the sacred oak at the edge of the encampment. This was no ordinary tree, it was a living testament to the gods, its roots intertwined with the earth's secrets, its branches stretching toward the stars. The Druid knelt before it, whispering prayers in a language older than memory. The leaves rustled in answer, though no wind stirred. The role of the Druids in war was unlike anything else. They were the keepers of balance, the bridge between the mortal and the divine. When armies gathered, it was the Druids who read the omens, interpreting the flight of birds, the patterns in the smoke, the whispers of the wind. Their insights could decide the fate of nations, their blessings transforming fear into unshakable resolve. But their power did not end with prophecy. Druids were warriors of the spirit, wielding forces that could turn the tide of battle. They were said to control the elements, calling forth storms to drown the enemy or commanding the earth to swallow their foes. Their chants, haunting and otherworldly, echoed across the battlefield, striking fear into the hearts of those who dared to defy them. On the eve of a great conflict, a young warrior approached the Druid. He was trembling, his face paled beneath the smudges of ash that marked him for battle. "Will I die tomorrow?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The Druid did not answer immediately. Instead, they reached into their satchel and withdrew a small bundle of herbs, their scent sharp and bitter. They placed the bundle in the warrior's hands, closing his fingers around it. "Hold this to your heart," they said. "It is not the question of death that matters, but the life you live until that moment. Fight with honor, and you will be remembered." The warrior nodded, his fear replaced by something stronger, a quiet determination, a flicker of light in the darkness. He left the Druid's side, his step steady now, his grip on his sword firm. The Druids did not only guide warriors, they shaped the very fabric of war. They determined the time and place of battles, choosing moments when the stars aligned, when the forces of nature were in their favor. They consecrated weapons and armor, anointing them with sacred oils and carving runes of protection into their surfaces. But they were also protectors of life, even in the face of death. When battles raged, it was the Druids who tended to the wounded, who offered comfort to the dying, who whispered prayers to carry the fallen into the afterlife. Their presence was a reminder that even in the midst of destruction, there was a thread of compassion, a glimpse of something greater. In one tale, a Druid named Eacade stood between two warring clans, their hatred for each other burning like wildfire. He raised his staff high, the wood etched with symbols of power, and his voice rang out above the din. "This land does not belong to you," he declared. "It is the land of the gods, and they weep at your hatred. Lay down your weapons, or face their wrath." The clans hesitated, their leaders locking eyes with the Druid. For a moment, the battlefield was silent, save for the crackle of torches and the distant cries of birds. Then, slowly, one by one, the warriors lowered their swords, their spears falling to the ground like leaves in autumn. Eacade did not smile or celebrate. He simply turned and walked away, his staff tapping against the earth with each step. The clans did not fight that day, their rage tempered by the druids' words. Not all druids were peacemakers, however. Some stood alongside their warriors, their chants rising above the clash of steel. They were feared by their enemies, for their magic was a weapon as deadly as any sword. A single word from a druid could send a warband fleeing, their courage shattered by visions of doom conjured in their minds. One such druid, a woman named Myrgen, was said to have ended an entire battle with a single spell. As the enemy advanced, she raised her arms and called upon the spirits of the land. The ground trembled, and a great fog rolled in, so thick that the warriors could not see their own hands before them. Disoriented and terrified, the enemy scattered, their cries fading into the mist. The warriors who fought alongside her would tell the tale for years, their voices filled with awe and reverence. "She saved us," they would say. She was the voice of the gods, and they answered her call. The druids' power was not just in their magic or their wisdom, it was in their ability to inspire, to ignite the hearts of those around them. They reminded warriors of what they were fighting for, not just land or glory, but the bonds that tied them to their people, their ancestors, their gods. As the fire in the sacred grove burned low, the druids stood and raised their staff once more. The warriors gathered around them, their faces solemn, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The druid's voice was steady, unyielding, as they spoke the final blessing. "Fight with honor, for the gods watch over you. Fight with strength, for your ancestors walk beside you. And fight with courage, for your spirit is eternal." The warriors bowed their heads, their fears melting away in the warmth of the druid's words. When the sun rose and the battle began, they would carry those words with them, a shield against the darkness, a beacon in the storm. The wind howled through the ancient trees, carrying whispers from voices long silenced by time. On the battlefield, a warrior knelt, her hand clutching a pendant engraved with the symbol of her clan. Her breaths came in short, sharp bursts, but her gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the mists of the otherworld seemed to bleed into the waking world. She could feel them, her ancestors, their spirits moving through the haze, watching her every move. The otherworld was never far. For the Celts, it was not a distant place, but a constant presence, woven into the fabric of life and death. It was said that on the eve of battle, the veil between realms thinned, allowing the spirits of the departed to walk among the living. These spirits did not come as passive observers, they came as guides, protectors, and sometimes, as harbingers of what was to come. The warrior tightened her grip on her sword, her fingers trembling not with fear but with reverence. She could almost hear them now, the voices of her forebears, their words urging her to stand, to fight, to honor the bloodline they had fought to preserve. Her heart swelled with a fierce pride, a burning need to prove herself worthy of their legacy. On the battlefield, the otherworld was both a comfort and a force to be reckoned with. Warriors would call upon their ancestors, chanting their names into the sky, their voices raw with emotion. They believed that these spirits could lend strength to their arms, guiding their swords and shielding them from harm. Some claimed to see the shadows of their ancestors beside them, spectral figures moving with an otherworldly grace, their ethereal weapons striking down foes with silent precision. But the influence of the otherworld was not limited to ancestors. Spirits of the land, the rivers, and the skies were said to rise in defense of their people. Before a great battle, druids would perform sacred rites, invoking these spirits and asking for their favor. Fires would burn brightly in the sacred groves, the air thick with the scent of herbs and the murmured prayers of those who understood the balance between worlds. In one tale, a chieftain named Brodin stood on the brink of war, his people outnumbered and his confidence shaken. That night, as he sat alone by the campfire, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with eyes that glowed like embers and hair as dark as the night sky. She was no mortal, he knew this the moment she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of countless lifetimes. "You are not alone," she told him. "The land remembers you. The river carries your name. The sky watches over you. And we, your kin, stand ready to fight at your side." Brodin fell to his knees, his heart pounding with a mix of awe and gratitude. When he rose the next morning, he carried her words with him like armor, an unshakable belief in the strength of his people and the spirits who walked among them. The other world was not always benevolent, however. There were spirits who thrived on chaos, who fed on the fear and bloodshed of battle. These were the phantoms that haunted the dreams of warriors, their laughter chilling and their presence a warning. To anger the spirits of the other world was to invite ruin, for their wrath was swift and unforgiving. One such story tells of a warrior who defied the sacred rites, dismissing the druids and mocking the spirits. On the day of battle, he found himself surrounded by an eerie silence. His comrades' voices faded into the distance, their forms dissolving like mist. He swung his sword wildly, but his strikes met only air. When the enemy advanced, he fell, his cries echoing into the emptiness. The others would later say that it was as if he had vanished before their eyes, claimed by the very forces he had scorned. For those who honored the other world, however, there was a power that could not be matched. Warriors spoke of moments when time seemed to slow, when their bodies moved with a speed and precision that felt almost supernatural. They described a surge of strength, a clarity of purpose, as if they were no longer fighting alone but as part of something much greater. These moments were not accidents. They were gifts, signs that the spirits of the other world had chosen to intervene. The warriors would recount these experiences with tears in their eyes, their voices trembling as they spoke of the warmth that enveloped them, the whispers that guided their hands. In the aftermath of battle, the survivors would gather to honor the spirits who had stood with them. They would light candles and offer food and drink, their voices rising in songs of gratitude. The dead were mourned, but not with despair, for they were not truly gone. They had simply crossed the veil, joining the ranks of those who watched from the other world. The warrior who had knelt before the pendant now stood, her face streaked with dirt and blood but her eyes alight with determination. As she charged into the fray, she felt their presence, a hand on her shoulder, a whisper in her ear, a surge of strength that carried her forward. She fought not for herself, but for them, for the spirits who had shaped her, for the ancestors who had given her life, for the land that had nurtured her people. And as the sun set on the battlefield, its light painting the skies in hues of fire and ash, the other world seemed closer than ever, its influence a living force that pulsed in the air. The spirits were there, watching, guiding, reminding the living that they were never truly alone. The air was thick with the scent of iron and the acrid taste of smoke. Shadows flickered across the battlefield as the sun struggled to pierce the storm-laden skies. A cold wind howled, carrying with it the cries of warriors and the unearthly roars of the Fomorians. On that day, the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of destiny. At the heart of the chaos stood Luff, his golden hair shimmering like fire against the gloom. His eyes burned with a light that cut through the darkest fears, a beacon of hope for his people. The Tuatha De Danann had gathered behind him, their armor glinting as they prepared to make their final stand. They knew what was at stake, their freedom, their land, their very survival. Across the field, the Fomorians loomed like nightmares given flesh. Giants with twisted forms, their bodies seemed to defy nature itself. Their leader, Balor of the Evil Eye, towered above them all, his single eye hidden beneath a heavy lid. The mere thought of that eye-opening struck terror into the hearts of men, for it was said that nothing could withstand its gaze. But fear had no place in Luffa's heart. He raised his spear high, its tip catching the light and casting it back as a promise of defiance. The ground beneath his feet felt alive, pulsing with the energy of his ancestors, of the gods themselves. He had been born for this moment, shaped by prophecy and honed by the trials of life. The clash began with a sound that seemed to shake the heavens. The Tuatha De Danann surged forward, their war cries mingling with the beating of their hearts. Each strike of their weapons carried the weight of centuries of hope and struggle. Opposing them, the Fomorians fought with savage brutality, their monstrous forms moving with a terrifying grace. The battlefield became a whirlwind of chaos, where bravery and terror collided in a dance of life and death. Warriors fell, their blood mingling with the earth, but none faltered. They fought not just for themselves, but for their kin, for the memory of those who had come before and for the promise of those yet to come. In the midst of the fray, Luff moved like a storm. His spear struck with unerring precision, each blow carving a path through the enemy. He was everywhere at once, a blur of gold and fire, his voice rising above the din as he called out commands and words of encouragement. His presence inspired those around him, driving them to feats of courage they had never imagined possible. Yet, the Fomorians were relentless. Baelor's forces pushed forward with an almost supernatural ferocity, their roars shaking the air and their blows landing with the force of thunder. The tide of battle seemed to teeter on the edge, ready to tip into despair. And then it happened. Baelor, sensing the moment to unleash his terrible power, began to lift the lid of his monstrous eye. The air grew heavy, the very light around him dimming as if the world itself recoiled from what was about to be revealed. But Luff was ready. With a speed that defied belief, he seized his sling and a smooth stone. As Baelor's eye began to open, Luff's arm moved, the stone flying like a comet through the air. It struck true, piercing Baelor's eye before its deadly gaze could fall upon the battlefield. The giant let out a roar that shook the mountains, his massive form swaying as if the earth beneath him had given way. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, every eye fixed on the monstrous figure. And then, with a deafening crash, Baelor fell, his body striking the ground like a collapsing mountain. A hush fell over the battlefield, broken only by the ragged breaths of the warriors. The Fomorians, seeing their leader defeated, wavered. Their once fearsome roars turned to cries of despair as the Tuatha De Danann rallied with renewed fervor. The tide had turned. With Baelor's death, the Tuatha De Danann surged forward, their swords and spears flashing like lightning. The Fomorians, once so terrifying, now seemed vulnerable, their monstrous forms retreating beneath the onslaught. The earth itself seemed to rise against them, as if the land had chosen its side. As the battle drew to a close, the Fomorians scattered, their forces broken and their spirits shattered. The Tuatha De Danann stood victorious, their banners raised high against the stormy skies. Their faces were streaked with sweat and blood, their bodies weary, but their hearts were unbowed. Luff stood at the center of it all, his spear still in hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He did not revel in the victory, for he knew the cost had been great. But he stood tall, a symbol of what it meant to fight for something greater than oneself. Around him, the surviving warriors knelt, their voices rising in a song of thanks and remembrance. The battlefield, once a place of terror and bloodshed, now seemed to breathe with a quiet peace. The spirits of the fallen lingered, their presence a gentle reminder of the price of freedom. The Tuatha De Danann would rebuild, their strength renewed by the bonds forged in the crucible of war. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, painting the land in hues of gold and red, it felt as if the world itself was honoring their victory. The defeat of the Fomorians was not just a triumph of arms, it was a triumph of spirit, a testament to the unyielding courage and unity of those who had stood together against the darkness. The chill of the night hung heavy over the fields of Ulster, the air thick with the scent of dew and distant smoke. Silence reigned, broken only by the occasional rustle of restless leaves. In the heart of this quiet stood Cuchulainn, his youthful frame taut with energy, his piercing eyes scanning the horizon. Though barely more than a boy, he carried the weight of a warrior far beyond his years. Tonight, he was Ulster's lone shield, standing against the might of Connacht. The raid had begun under the shadow of ambition. Queen Medb of Connacht, driven by her desire for the prized bull Don Quaonge, had unleashed her armies upon Ulster. Yet, fate had conspired to leave Ulster's warriors stricken, their strength sapped by a mysterious curse. Only Cuchulainn remained, unbroken and unwavering, the singular force standing between Medb's horde and his homeland. As the first glimmers of dawn painted the edges of the sky, the earth trembled beneath the march of Medb's forces. Thousands of warriors moved as one, their armor clinking like a grim symphony. Against this tide stood Cuchulainn, a solitary figure silhouetted against the dim light. His spear rested lightly in his hand, but his grip spoke of readiness, of fire waiting to be unleashed. The first challengers approached with mocking laughter, their arrogance ringing louder than their weapons. They saw only a boy, a mere obstacle on their path to conquest. But they did not see the storm that lay hidden within him. When Cuchulainn moved, it was as though the air itself bent to his will. His spear danced, a blur of motion that struck with precision and power. One by one, they fell, their boasts silenced by the young warrior's unrelenting fury. Yet, this was only the beginning. For days and nights, Cuchulainn stood alone, holding the ford that marked the gateway to Ulster. His enemies came in waves, each more determined than the last. But the Hound of Ulster, as he was called, was tireless. His strength seemed inexhaustible, his resolve unshakable. His feats became legend even as they unfolded, shattering chariots with a single strike, leaping across rivers to outflank his foes, and calling upon his otherworldly Ryostrad, the Warpspasm, which transformed him into a creature of unstoppable ferocity. The Ryostrad was both a blessing and a curse. When it consumed him, Cuchulainn became something beyond mortal, a force of nature, a whirlwind of destruction. His body twisted and contorted, his face burned with a terrible light, and his screams echoed like thunder. Friend and foe alike trembled at the sight, for he became a harbinger of death, a living weapon with no equal. But even in his moments of triumph, there was a deep loneliness in his eyes. Every strike of his spear, every swing of his sword carried the weight of isolation. He was a child forced into the role of protector, a hero whose victories came at the cost of his own innocence. The blood he spilled stained not just his hands, but his heart, a mark he could never wash away. As the battle raged on, the legend of Cuchulainn grew. The warriors of Connacht began to fear the very mention of his name. They whispered of the boy who could not be defeated, the hound who fought with the strength of 100 men. But Queen Med, undeterred, sought to break him through cunning rather than force. One fateful day, Cuchulainn faced his greatest challenge yet. His opponent was not a nameless warrior but Ferdia, his closest friend and foster brother. The bond they shared had been forged in the fires of youth, a connection as strong as iron. But now, they stood on opposite sides of the ford, their weapons raised, their hearts heavy with the weight of duty. The battle between Cuchulainn and Ferdia was unlike any other. For 3 days, they fought, their strength and skill evenly matched. Each blow was delivered with the precision of a master, each parry a testament to their shared training. Yet, beneath the clash of steel lay a profound sorrow. Every strike was a betrayal of the bond they had once cherished. On the 4th day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the ford ran red with blood. Cuchulainn, driven by desperation and love for his homeland, delivered the fatal blow. Ferdia fell, his body collapsing into the water. Cuchulainn knelt beside him, his hands trembling as he cradled his friend's lifeless form. Tears streamed down his face, mingling with the blood that stained his cheeks. In that moment, the Hound of Ulster was not a hero, but a boy mourning the loss of his brother. The death of Ferdia marked a turning point in the raid. Cuchulainn's enemies saw not just his strength, but his humanity, the unyielding spirit of one who fought not for glory, but for love of his people. They began to falter, their resolve weakened by the realization that they faced more than a warrior, they faced a legend. As Med's forces retreated, Cuchulainn remained at the ford, his body battered, his spirit worn. He had saved Ulster, but the cost was etched into his very soul. The echoes of battle faded, leaving only silence and the haunting memories of those he had lost. In the quiet of the night, beneath the endless expanse of stars, Cuchulainn stood alone. The Hound of Ulster had fulfilled his duty, but the price of his heroism would forever linger in the depths of his heart. The wind howled like a wounded beast across the hills of Ulster, carrying with it the scent of blood and smoke. The Red Branch Knights stood proud, their armor battered but their spirits unbroken. They had faced countless battles, their bravery sung across the land, but tonight was different. A shadow loomed over them, one born not of mere mortal foes, but of betrayal and the cruel hand of fate. Cu Roy, the enigmatic and formidable warrior king of Munster, had once been a name of awe and reverence. His cunning was unmatched, his strength legendary, and his command of sorcery sent chills down the spines of even the bravest. But now, his name struck a different chord. The man who had once stood as an ally to the Ulaid now sought their ruin, driven by vengeance and the whisper of ancient grudges. The Red Branch Knights had gathered, their swords drawn, their faces grim. Each man carried the weight of knowing this fight would be their last. The bond they shared was more than camaraderie, it was forged through trials and triumphs, a brotherhood that could never be severed by death. Their leader, Concobar Magnessa, stood at the forefront, his voice a rallying cry that pierced the darkened sky. Across the battlefield, Cu Royas forces assembled like a storm waiting to break. Their banners, dark as the night itself, fluttered in the wind. At their center stood Cu Roy, his figure imposing and unyielding. His eyes burned with a mix of anger and sorrow, a reflection of the complex emotions that had driven him to this moment. He raised his enchanted blade high, its edge gleaming with a light that seemed almost alive. The battle began with a clash that echoed through the valleys, a symphony of steel and screams. The Red Branch Knights fought like men possessed, their movements precise and unrelenting. They knew the terrain well, every rise and dip of the land a weapon in their hands. But for every foe they felled, more seemed to rise, their numbers an unending tide. Cu Chulainn was among them, his spear weaving through the enemy ranks with devastating speed. His presence was like a beacon, a force of nature that inspired his comrades to push beyond their limits. Yet even he, the Hound of Ulster, felt the weight of this battle. For every victory, there was a cost, and the ground beneath his feet was soaked with the blood of his brothers. The night wore on, and the tide began to turn against the Ulaid. Cu Royas' forces pressed forward with unrelenting ferocity, their morale bolstered by their king's commanding presence. The air grew thick with despair, yet the Red Branch Knights did not falter. Each man fought as though the survival of Ulster depended on his blade alone. Amidst the chaos, Cu Roy and Cu Chulainn finally met on the battlefield. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. There was no hatred in their gaze, only a shared understanding of the path that had brought them here. They were warriors bound by destiny, their fates entwined in a dance of blood and fire. The duel that followed was nothing short of legendary. Each strike was a testament to their unmatched skill, every movement a calculated risk. Sparks flew as their weapons clashed, the sound ringing out like thunder. The warriors around them paused, drawn into the gravity of their confrontation. But as the battle raged, it became clear that this was not a fight either man could truly win. Their strength was evenly matched, their resolve unshakable. While the duel raged, the Red Branch Knights found themselves overwhelmed. One by one, they fell, their cries of defiance silenced by the weight of numbers. Yet even in their final moments, they stood as symbols of courage, their sacrifice a testament to their loyalty and love for their land. Each death was a wound to Cu Chulainn's heart, a reminder of the cost of war and the fragility of life. When dawn broke, the battlefield was silent, save for the cries of the wounded and the whispers of the dying. The Red Branch Knights were no more, their ranks decimated, their banners torn. Cu Chulainn knelt among the fallen, his body battered, his spirit fractured. His duel with Cu Roy had ended in a draw, neither man able to claim victory. But the price of their conflict was written in the blood that stained the earth. Cu Roy stood at a distance, his expression unreadable. He had won the war, but there was no triumph in his stance. He turned and walked away, leaving the battlefield and the memories of what had been behind. For him, the victory was hollow, the echoes of friendship and honor lost in the tide of vengeance. The Red Branch Knights had fought their last battle, their legacy etched into the annals of history. They were heroes, not for their victories, but for their unwavering courage and loyalty. The War of the Ulaid was over, but its scars would remain, a reminder of the cost of ambition and the fragility of even the strongest bonds. The air was thick with tension as the sun rose over Clontarf, its light casting a golden glow on the waters of the River Liffey. For a moment, there was peace, a fragile silence that felt like the calm before a storm. Men stood ready, their faces marked by determination and dread. They were warriors from every corner of Ireland, bound together under one banner, their hearts beating with the hope of freedom and the fear of death. At the center of it all stood Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland. His hair, silvered by age, gleamed in the morning light, and his gaze was steady, filled with wisdom and resolve. At 73, he was no longer the fiery warrior of his youth, but his presence alone was enough to inspire his men. He had spent his life fighting for the unity of Ireland, to free his people from the Norse invaders who had plagued the land for generations. Today, he would see that dream tested on the battlefield. On the other side of the field, the Viking forces gathered like a dark tide, their war cries rising to challenge the heavens. Their leader, Sigtryg's Silkbeard, stood tall, his armor reflecting the sun's rays. The Norsemen had come to claim dominance, to shatter Brian's vision of a united Ireland. Their mercenaries, hardened warriors from across the seas, waited with eager bloodlust, their weapons sharp and ready to cut down anyone who stood in their way. When the first battle horn sounded, it tore through the stillness like a blade. The ground seemed to tremble as thousands of warriors surged forward, a thunderous clash of steel and shields erupting in the morning light. The Irish forces, led by Brian's sons Merchant and Tig, fought with ferocity, their cries echoing across the battlefield. Every strike was a declaration, every step forward a testament to their unyielding spirit. Brian watched from his tent, his heart heavy with the weight of the moment. His advisors had urged him to stay out of the fray, his role was to guide, to pray for victory. But the sounds of battle tugged at his soul, every cry of pain, every clash of weapons, igniting the fire that still burned within him. He knelt beside a small altar, his hands trembling as he clutched his rosary. His prayers were fervent, a plea for strength and protection for his men, for the land he loved more than life itself. On the battlefield, the fighting was brutal. Merchant led the Irish forces with unmatched bravery, his sword carving through the Viking ranks like a scythe. He was a figure of raw power, his movements precise and deadly. But even he could feel the toll of the battle, the weight of every life taken and every comrade lost. The Vikings fought with relentless ferocity, their berserkers tearing through the Irish lines with reckless abandon. As the hours wore on, the field became a nightmare of blood and chaos. Bodies lay strewn across the earth, their lifeless eyes staring into the sky. The cries of the wounded mingled with the clash of steel, a symphony of agony and defiance. Merchant pressed on, his voice rising above the din as he rallied his men. For Ireland, he shouted, his words a beacon in the darkness. But even heroes are mortal. In a moment of vulnerability, Merchant was struck down, his body crumpling to the ground. The sight of their leader falling sent a shockwave through the Irish forces, their resolve faltering. Yet, in his final moments, Merchant's spirit seemed to ignite those around him. His men fought harder, their grief fueling their determination. As the tide began to turn in favor of the Irish, a Viking mercenary slipped away from the chaos. His target was not a warrior, but the man who held the heart of Ireland in his hands. Brian Boru, unaware of the danger, remained in his tent, his prayers uninterrupted. The assassin crept closer, his blade gleaming with malice. Brian's guards fought valiantly to stop the intruder, their lives sacrificed in defense of their king. But the Viking was cunning and relentless. He burst into the tent, his blade raised high. Brian rose to meet him, his frailty no match for the warrior's strength. In one swift motion, the blade struck, and the High King of Ireland fell. The assassin did not live to see the victory he thought he had claimed. The Irish forces overwhelmed the Vikings, driving them back into the sea. By the time the battle ended, the field was a graveyard, a testament to the cost of freedom. When the news of Brian's death spread, it was met with a mix of triumph and heartbreak. They had won the battle, but at the cost of their greatest leader. His dream of a united Ireland had not died with him, but the path forward would be marked by his absence. The battlefield at Clontarf became a place of mourning, the blood-soaked earth a silent witness to the sacrifices made. Brian Boru, the High King, the unifier, was gone. But his legacy endured, etched into the hearts of those who fought and the land they defended. The river shimmered under the pale light of dawn, its surface deceptively calm as it flowed between the two armies. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the tension of impending violence. Warriors stood on either side of the ford, their breaths visible in the chill of the morning. Each side waited, hearts pounding, for the moment when the stillness would shatter into chaos. In the center of it all stood the two kings, their fates entwined by an unspoken pact. They were not ordinary men. Their presence carried a weight that silenced the whispers of their warriors. One was tall and proud, his armor gleaming in the dim light, a symbol of defiance and unwavering resolve. The other was cloaked in shadow, his movements deliberate, his gaze steady as though he could see the threads of destiny binding them to this moment. The ford, narrow and treacherous, was the only passage across the river. It had become a battlefield not just for the control of land, but for the pride and honor of these two kings. Neither would retreat, neither would concede. The river itself seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, its gentle currents whispering a song of foreboding. The first clash of swords came like a crack of thunder. Warriors surged forward, their cries piercing the silence as steel met steel. The water churned red as the ford became a cauldron of fury, men grappling with each other in the icy depths. Every blow landed with the weight of desperation, every step forward a struggle against the tide of death. Amid the chaos, the two kings strode toward the center of the ford. They moved with purpose, their warriors parting to allow their fateful meeting. The river splashed against their boots as they faced each other, their breaths forming clouds in the cold air. There was no need for words, their eyes spoke of grudges held, of promises made, of kingdoms they fought to protect. Their swords met with a sound that echoed across the battlefield, a clash that seemed to split the sky. Each strike was precise, each parry a testament to their skill and determination. They fought not just for themselves, but for the men who had followed them, for the legacies they hoped to leave behind. The river, once calm, now surged around them as though it, too, was swept up in their struggle. The first king, younger and swifter, pressed his advantage with a series of fierce strikes. His sword moved like lightning, seeking the vulnerabilities in his opponent's defense. But the second king was not easily outmatched. He met each blow with unyielding strength, his movements calculated and deliberate. He fought like a man who had faced countless battles, his scars a testament to his endurance. Around them, the battle raged on. Warriors screamed in defiance as they fell, their blood mingling with the river's icy waters. Shields splintered, and spears were cast aside as the men engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Yet even amidst the carnage, all eyes were drawn to the two kings. Their duel was the heart of the battle, a dance of death that held the fate of their armies in its balance. The younger king landed a blow that sent his opponent stumbling back. For a moment, it seemed as though victory was within his grasp. He raised his sword, his chest heaving, his face a mask of determination. But the elder king, driven by a will forged in fire and loss, rallied. With a roar that shook the air, he surged forward, his blade slicing through the younger king's defenses. The two men locked swords again, their faces inches apart, their breaths mingling in the cold air. They could feel the weight of each other's resolve, the burden of the lives depending on their strength. The river surged around them, its waters rising as though trying to claim them both. The battle reached its crescendo as the kings exchanged blow after blow, their movements a blur of steel and sweat. Every strike was met with defiance, every wound ignored in the face of their shared destiny. The warriors on both sides had stopped fighting, their gazes fixed on the duel that would decide their fates. In the end, it was not strength, but the smallest of missteps that determined the outcome. The younger king's foot slipped on a moss-covered stone, his balance faltering for just an instant. It was enough. The elder king seized the moment, his sword finding its mark. The younger king staggered, his sword falling from his grasp as he dropped to his knees in the freezing water. The elder king stood over him, his chest heaving, his sword trembling in his hand. For a moment, he hesitated, his gaze meeting that of his defeated foe. In that instant, there was no hatred, no anger, only a shared understanding of what it meant to bear the weight of a crown. With a final, swift stroke, the elder king ended the duel. The river, now red with blood, seemed to mourn as it carried the younger king's body downstream. The warriors on both sides stood in stunned silence, their weapons lowered, their hearts heavy. The elder king turned to face his men, his face a mask of sorrow and triumph. He raised his sword high, the bloodied blade catching the light. His warriors roared in response, their cries echoing across the battlefield. The victory was theirs, but it had come at a cost that would linger in their hearts for years to come. The river, its waters once clear and calm, now flowed dark and turbulent, a silent witness to the tragedy and glory of that day. And as the sun set over the ford, the elder king stood alone, his gaze fixed on the horizon, the weight of his victory heavier than the crown he wore. The cold wind swept across the desolate battlefield, carrying with it the echoes of heartbreak and vengeance. In the distance, the cries of swans pierced the air, haunting and filled with sorrow, as if the earth itself mourned the tragedy unfolding. These were no ordinary swans, and their song carried the weight of a curse, a love betrayed, and a war waged in their name. The children of Lyre had once been the pride of their father, blessed with beauty and grace that seemed otherworldly. Fionnuala, the eldest, with her strength and wisdom, led her siblings with a quiet dignity. Aegon, the valiant and brave, was her mirror in courage. The twins, Fiacra and Con, were inseparable, their laughter a melody of joy that once filled their father's halls. But that was before jealousy's shadow fell across their lives, before Aoife, their stepmother, unleashed her cruel magic to transform them into swans. Their wings now bore the weight of enchantment, and their voices, though beautiful, sang of despair. Yet even in their cursed form, their bond remained unbroken, their love a shield against the world's cruelty. Their plight became a tale whispered across the lands, a story that stirred the hearts of warriors and poets alike. Among those who heard the tale was a prince driven not by duty but by a fiery determination to right the wrongs of the world. His name was Kieran, a warrior with eyes like storm clouds and a heart that burned with both love and vengeance. He had once seen the children of Lyre in their human form, their laughter echoing through his childhood memories. Their transformation had kindled a rage in him, a refusal to let their suffering go unanswered. The battlefield was where his fury would take shape. Word had spread that Aoife's supporters, those who had aided her in her dark sorcery, had gathered to protect her from justice. They were a formidable force, bound not by honor but by greed and fear. Kieran stood at the head of his army, his sword gleaming in the pale light, a symbol of his unyielding resolve. The battle began with a roar that seemed to shake the heavens. Kieran's men surged forward, their war cries a symphony of defiance. Steel met steel in a brutal dance, and the earth beneath their feet turned red with the blood of the fallen. Kieran fought with a ferocity that seemed almost otherworldly, his blade cutting through his enemies like a force of nature. But the enemy was relentless, their numbers vast, their resolve bolstered by desperation. Kieran's men faltered, their courage wavering as the weight of the battle pressed down upon them. It was then that the swans appeared, their white feathers gleaming against the darkness of the battlefield. Their song rose above the clamor, a melody of love and loss that seemed to pierce the hearts of all who heard it. Kieran, bloodied and battered, looked up at the swans and felt a surge of strength he could not explain. Their song was not just a lament, it was a call to arms, a reminder of what he was fighting for. With a roar, he rallied his men, his voice cutting through the chaos like a beacon. The tide of the battle turned. Kieran and his warriors pushed forward, their determination renewed. The enemy, shaken by the haunting melody and the unyielding resolve of their foes, began to falter. Aoife's supporters fell one by one, their cries swallowed by the storm of vengeance that swept across the battlefield. As the battle raged on, Kieran found himself face to face with Aoife's most loyal lieutenant, a towering figure clad in black armor. Their swords met with a clash that echoed like thunder, and the two warriors engaged in a deadly duel. The lieutenant was a formidable opponent, his strikes heavy and precise. But Kieran fought with the fury of a man who had seen too much pain, his every move fueled by the memory of the children of Lyre's plight. The duel ended with a single, devastating blow. Kieran's sword found its mark, and the lieutenant fell to his knees, his armor clattering as he collapsed to the ground. With their leader defeated, Aoife's forces scattered, their will to fight broken. The battlefield fell silent, the only sound the gentle lapping of the river and the mournful song of the swans. Kieran, his sword still in hand, turned to face the children of Lyre. Their eyes, filled with gratitude and sorrow, met his, and in that moment, he felt the weight of their curse more acutely than ever before. Though the battle had been won, the curse remained unbroken. The swans took flight, their wings carrying them toward the horizon, their song fading into the distance. Kieran watched them go, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his victory, though hard-fought, had not brought them the freedom they deserved. As the sun set over the battlefield, its golden light casting long shadows across the land, Kieran knelt in the blood-stained earth. His men gathered around him, their faces weary but proud. Together, they mourned the lives lost and the victory that, though triumphant, could never truly heal the wounds inflicted by Aoife's cruelty. The wind carried the swan's song into the night, a haunting reminder of the love and vengeance that had driven them all to that fateful day. And as the stars emerged to light the darkened sky, the warriors vowed never to forget the children of Lyre, whose suffering had become a testament to the enduring power of love and the unrelenting pursuit of justice. The air hung heavy with the scent of earth and smoke, and the ground beneath them trembled as the army advanced. Celtic, queen of an ancient land and a figure of unmatched grace and wisdom, stood at the forefront. Her presence alone was enough to silence a crowd, her eyes reflecting both the pain of sacrifice and the fierce determination of a ruler who refused to yield. She was no stranger to war, but this battle felt different, as though the gods themselves had orchestrated it to test the very fabric of her spirit. Her voice, calm yet commanding, echoed over the murmurs of her warriors. She carried not just the weight of her people's hopes, but the memories of a life filled with love, loss, and an unshakable duty. Celtic had given everything to nurture her land, a place where the soil sang with fertility and the rivers whispered stories of her gentle hand. Yet here she stood, on the cusp of destruction, prepared to fight for what remained. The opposing force loomed on the horizon, a sea of shadowed figures moving with chilling precision. Their leader, a man driven by hunger for power, had laid claim to the land that Celtic had poured her soul into. This wasn't just a clash of swords and shields, it was a battle for the very heart of the kingdom. As the armies collided, the clash of steel against steel rang out like a dirge, raw and unrelenting. Celtic fought with a ferocity that belied her graceful frame, her blade carving through the chaos. Her warriors rallied around her, their spirits ignited by her courage. To them, she was not just their queen, she was their beacon of hope. But even as the battle raged, Celtic felt the strain creeping into her limbs. Each swing of her sword came slower, each step heavier. The burden she bore was not just physical, it was the weight of knowing that this fight could mean her end. Still, she pressed on, her resolve unshaken. In the midst of the chaos, she caught sight of a young warrior struggling to fend off two enemies. Without hesitation, she surged forward, her blade flashing as she dispatched the attackers with swift, precise strikes. The warrior looked up at her, his face a mixture of awe and gratitude. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to fade, and Celtic saw not a soldier, but a child, someone who would one day carry the stories of this day forward. Her heart ached with a love so profound it brought tears to her eyes, but there was no time for mourning. The tide of the battle was turning, and she knew what she had to do. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, she rallied her warriors for one final charge. Her voice rose above the din of the battlefield, strong and unyielding. "For our land, for our people, stand with me." Her words carried the weight of her love for them, and they answered her call with a roar that shook the heavens. The charge was relentless, a wave of defiance crashing against the enemy lines. Celtic led them, her every movement a testament to her unbreakable spirit. The enemy faltered, their ranks breaking as the Queen's army pushed forward. For a moment, victory seemed within reach. But the gods, it seemed, had other plans. A cry went up as Celtic fell, her body crumpling to the ground like a flower wilting under an unrelenting sun. Time seemed to slow as her warriors surged to her side, their cries of rage and despair echoing across the battlefield. Celtic lay in the arms of her people, her breath shallow but steady. Her eyes, still filled with that unyielding determination, locked onto the horizon. "Protect the land," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of a command. "Protect what we have built together." The battle raged on around them, but for those who bore witness to their queen's final moments, the world seemed to stand still. Her warriors fought with renewed fury, their hearts fueled by the love and sacrifice of the woman who had given everything for them. As the sun set over the blood-stained fields, casting the land in hues of gold and crimson, Teal'c's legacy was etched into the hearts of her people. Her name would not be forgotten, her story told for generations to come, a tale of a queen who loved so deeply that she gave her life to protect the one she held dear. And though the battle claimed her life, the land she fought for remained. The soil carried her spirit, the rivers sang her song, and the people walked forward with her memory as their guide. For in the end, Teal'c was more than a queen, she was the heart of her kingdom, a light that would never fade. The sea churned with an unnatural fury, as if the very waters were recoiling from the evil they carried. On the horizon, dark shapes loomed, massive ships, their prows carved into grotesque forms that seemed to sneer at the land they approached. The Fomorians had arrived, their fleet a harbinger of dread, their intentions unmistakable. The sky above them darkened, the sun veiling itself behind thick, swirling clouds, as if unwilling to witness what was to come. The people of the land had heard the whispers, stories of the Fomorians, beings of terrible power and cruelty, who emerged from the shadows of the sea to claim what was not theirs. They were not merely invaders, they were forces of chaos, their very presence a curse upon the earth. Their leader, Balor of the Evil Eye, was said to possess a gaze so deadly that a single glance could reduce armies to ash. On the cliffs overlooking the shore, the warriors of the Tuatha De Danann stood like sentinels, their faces etched with resolve. Among them was their leader, Nuada of the Silver Hand, a figure who radiated strength and determination despite the scars of past battles. He had faced the Fomorians before and knew well the cost of their wrath. Yet he also knew the cost of surrender. As the first Fomorian ship touched the shore, a bone-chilling silence fell. The warriors tightened their grips on their weapons, their hearts pounding like war drums. The air was electric with tension, a crackling energy that seemed to hold the world in its grasp. And then, with a guttural roar, the Fomorians poured forth, their twisted forms an unholy blend of man and monster. The clash was immediate and ferocious, a storm of steel and fury. The warriors of the Tuatha De Danann fought with a grace and precision that belied their mortal forms, their movements a dance of defiance. But the Fomorians were relentless, their sheer size and brute strength overwhelming. For every enemy felled, another seemed to rise, their numbers a ceaseless tide. In the midst of the chaos, Nuada stood as a beacon of hope, his silver hand gleaming like a star in the dim light. His sword sang through the air, each strike a testament to his unwavering resolve. Beside him fought Luff, the warrior prodigy whose very presence seemed to embolden their forces. Luff's spear struck with an almost supernatural accuracy, each thrust a death sentence to the enemy. But even as the Tuatha De Danann held their ground, the shadow of Balor loomed ever closer. The giant's eye, hidden beneath a heavy lid, remained closed, but the threat of its opening was enough to send a ripple of unease through the ranks. The warriors knew that if Balor unleashed his gaze, there would be no hope of victory. The battle surged forward, the ground slick with blood, the air thick with the cries of the wounded and the dying. Nuada pushed his warriors onward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold the line. For our people, for our land, we will not falter." But Balor had no intention of retreating. The Fomorian leader strode onto the battlefield, his presence an oppressive weight. His single eye glimmered with malice, its lid beginning to lift. Fear rippled through the Tuatha De Danann, their courage tested as the shadow of death crept closer. It was Luff who stepped forward, his spear in hand, his eyes blazing with determination. He was young, but his spirit burned brighter than the sun. He had heard the prophecies, the whispers that spoke of his destiny to face Balor. And now, standing before the towering figure of destruction, he felt the weight of that destiny settle upon him. The battlefield seemed to hold its breath as Luff raised his spear, his grip steady despite the enormity of the moment. Balor's eye opened fully, a terrible light pouring forth, but Luff was faster. With a cry that shook the heavens, he hurled his spear with all his might, the weapon slicing through the air like a comet. The impact was immediate and devastating. The spear struck Balor's eye, the force of it shattering the lid and piercing deep into the giant's skull. A roar of anguish erupted from Balor, a sound so primal it seemed to shake the very earth. The light from his eye dimmed, flickered, and then was gone. The Fomorian forces faltered, their will shattered with the fall of their leader. The warriors of the Tuatha De Danann seized the moment, their battle cries rising in a unified roar as they pressed forward. The tide of the battle turned, the once unstoppable invaders now retreating in disarray. But victory came at a cost. The battlefield was a graveyard, the fallen lying where they had fought and bled. Nuada himself was among them, his silver hand still clutching his sword, his face a mask of peace and death. His sacrifice, like so many others, would not be forgotten. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, its light bathing the land in a golden glow, the survivors stood in silence. The Fomorians were defeated, their invasion repelled, but the scars of the battle would remain. Luff knelt beside Nuada, his heart heavy with grief but also with gratitude. The land had been saved, and with it, the legacy of those who had fought and fallen. And though the sea would carry away the remnants of the Fomorian fleet, the memory of their invasion would linger. It would be told and retold, a story of courage and sacrifice, of light overcoming darkness. It would be a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the spirit of a people could endure. The air smelled of rain and blood. A cold mist clung to the ground, curling around the feet of the warriors gathered on the battlefield. The kings of Connacht stood side by side, their armor gleaming faintly in the dim light of dawn. There was no sound but the slow, rhythmic pounding of hearts, each beat heavy with anticipation. They had come together, united by a fragile alliance, but the weight of their decisions hung between them like an unspoken curse. Among them was the young king, his face pale but his eyes determined. He had fought battles before, but this was different. This was not just a clash of swords and shields, it was a reckoning. The blood that would soon stain the earth would not only belong to their enemies but also to themselves. The silence was broken by the distant echo of hoofbeats, faint at first but growing louder, more menacing. The enemy was approaching, their numbers vast, their intent clear. The kings of Connacht exchanged glances, each one reading the fear and resolve in the other's faces. They were bound not just by loyalty but by the knowledge that this day would end in devastation. When the enemy finally emerged from the mist, they seemed like ghosts, their shapes distorted by the haze. But as they drew closer, the ghostly forms solidified into men, men with weapons raised and eyes filled with hatred. The kings gave the signal, and their forces surged forward, the clash of steel shattering the stillness. The young king fought with the desperation of a man who knew the odds were against him. His sword was an extension of his will, cutting through the air with a fierce determination. Around him, the cries of the dying filled the air, each one a reminder of the cost of their resistance. But the alliance was fragile, and as the battle raged on, cracks began to show. Distrust simmered beneath the surface, and the kings who had once stood as brothers now eyed each other with suspicion. In the heat of the battle, alliances faltered, and betrayals were born. The young king found himself surrounded, his allies nowhere to be seen. The enemy pressed in, their faces twisted with triumph. He fought valiantly, his movements a blur of desperation and skill, but he was outnumbered. A blade found its mark, piercing his side, and he fell to his knees. Around him, the battlefield descended into chaos. The kings of Connacht turned on one another, their swords no longer aimed at the enemy but at each other. The slaughter was merciless, a frenzied cacophony of screams and steel. The mist that had once cloaked the battlefield now mingled with the smoke of burning bodies and the stench of death. The kings lay fallen, their crowns shattered, their dreams of glory reduced to ash. But even in the midst of the carnage, there was a strange, haunting beauty. The rain began to fall, washing away the blood and the grime, as if the heavens themselves wept for what had been lost. The young king, his life ebbing away, looked to the sky, his lips moving in a silent prayer. The battlefield grew quiet, the sounds of battle replaced by the soft patter of rain. The kings of Connacht were no more, their lives claimed by their own ambitions and the weight of their decisions. The land they had fought so fiercely to protect lay still, a silent witness to their fall. The mist began to lift, revealing the full scope of the devastation. The bodies of the fallen lay scattered, their faces frozen in expressions of pain and defiance. The ground, once fertile and green, was now a graveyard, a place where memories of bravery and betrayal would linger. And so, the story of the Great Slaughter would be told, a tale of kings who fought and died not just for their people but for their pride and their dreams. A tale of sacrifice, of loyalty and betrayal, of courage and despair. A tale that would echo through the ages, a reminder of the cost of ambition and the fragility of alliances. The air around the ancient hill was heavy with the scent of wet earth and smoke. Tara, once the heart of power and pride, stood shrouded in an eerie silence. The skies were overcast, a gray veil casting its shadow over the gathered warriors. It was as if the heavens themselves held their breath, knowing what was to come. Beneath the clouds, the banners of the kingdom of Tara fluttered in the wind. The High King's forces were assembled, a sea of determined faces, their armor gleaming faintly in the dim light. These were men who had grown up with tales of Tara's glory, who believed in its enduring strength. Yet behind their resolve was a flicker of uncertainty. They had heard the whispers of dissent, the murmurs of rebellion that had grown louder over the years. Across the battlefield stood the rebels, their eyes burning with the fire of conviction. They carried the weight of desperation, the kind born from years of feeling unseen and unheard. They were not just fighting for power, but for a chance to break free from the shadow of Tara's dominance. The first sounds of battle came like a rumble of distant thunder. Swords clashed, shields splintered, and the cries of men filled the air. The once tranquil hills of Tara were transformed into a theater of chaos, a stage for the final act of a kingdom teetering on the edge of ruin. The High King rode at the front, his presence commanding yet burdened. He was no stranger to war, but this battle carried a weight unlike any he had faced before. This was not just a fight for land or riches, it was a fight for Tara's legacy. Each swing of his sword was a cry against the tide of change threatening to consume his kingdom. But the rebellion was relentless. Wave after wave of warriors charged forward, their cries echoing like a storm crashing against the walls of tradition. They fought with a ferocity that shook the ground beneath them, their strikes fueled by the hope of a new era. Among the chaos, moments of profound humanity shone through. A soldier, barely a man, clutched a talisman around his neck, whispering prayers to a god he wasn't sure was listening. A rebel paused in the heat of the battle to pull a wounded comrade to safety, their bond stronger than the conflict dividing them. The ground was slick with mud and blood, the once proud banners of Tara now stained and tattered. The High King's forces began to falter, their lines breaking under the sheer force of the rebellion's onslaught. The king himself fought with the desperation of a man trying to hold back an inevitable tide. His strikes were precise, his movements calculated, but even he could not ignore the cracks forming in his army's defense. In the distance, the hills seemed to watch, silent witnesses to the unraveling of a kingdom that had once claimed dominion over them. The spirits of ancestors long gone seemed to linger, their presence a reminder of the fleeting nature of power and the enduring weight of history. As the sun began to set, the battlefield was awash in a golden glow, a stark contrast to the carnage below. The High King, his armor dented and his face smeared with dirt and blood, stood surrounded by the few loyal warriors who remained. His gaze swept over the battlefield, taking in the faces of his men, the rebels, and the land that had defined his reign. A single arrow flew through the air, its path unerring. It struck the king, piercing his side, and he fell to his knees. The sound of his fall seemed to echo, louder than the clash of swords or the cries of men. The warriors around him hesitated, their resolve shaken by the sight of their leader brought low. The rebels seized the moment, their final charge swift and decisive. The forces of Tara crumbled, their once mighty kingdom reduced to scattered remnants. The rebel leader stepped forward, his eyes meeting the High King's as he stood over him. There was no triumph in his gaze, only the heavy burden of what had been done. As the High King's life ebbed away, he reached out, his hand brushing the ground of Tara one last time. His lips moved, forming words lost to the noise around him. Perhaps he was speaking to the gods, to the land, or to the generations that would come after him. The battle ended as abruptly as it began, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the din of war. Tara had fallen, its legacy fractured, its people left to rebuild amidst the ruins of what once was. The wind swept across the battlefield, carrying with it the mingled scents of earth and ash, a haunting reminder of the cost of change. And as the last light of day faded, the Hill of Terror stood quiet once more, its ancient stones bearing witness to the rise and fall of those who had claimed it as their own. The Kingdom of Terra, once a beacon of unity and power, was now a memory etched into the land and the hearts of those who had fought for and against it. The sky above the battlefield churned with dark clouds, heavy with the promise of a storm. The air was alive with tension, the kind that sinks into the bones and tells you that something monumental is about to happen. The warriors of the Tuatha De Danann stood in resolute silence, their faces marked with both defiance and fear. Across from them loomed the Fomorians, their monstrous forms casting long shadows over the land, their eyes glinting with malice and the hunger for dominance. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the armies moved into position. It was not just a clash of warriors, but a struggle between two forces that represented opposing worlds, light and dark, creation and destruction. The Tuatha De Danann fought for balance and sovereignty, while the Fomorians sought to shroud the land in chaos and tyranny. A cold wind swept through the ranks, carrying with it the smell of the sea and something far more ominous, something ancient and malevolent. From the Fomorian side, Balor of the Evil Eye stood towering above all others, his single deadly eye closed for now but promising ruin when opened. His presence was a reminder of the cost of failure, a weight that bore down even on the bravest of hearts. Nuada, the leader of the Tuatha De Danann, raised his silver hand high, its gleam a beacon of hope amidst the gathering darkness. He did not speak, for words were no longer needed. Every warrior there understood the stakes. They were fighting for the survival of their people, their way of life, and the very soul of their land. The first clash was deafening. Spears flew like deadly rain, and the clash of swords echoed like thunder. The ground beneath them quickly became slick with blood and churned into mud by the trampling of countless feet. The Tuatha De Danann moved with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly, their connection to the land evident in every step and strike. Yet the Fomorians were brutal, their strength unnatural, their blows heavy enough to break stone and shatter shields. Luff, the shining warrior of the Tuatha De Danann, moved through the chaos like a streak of light. His golden hair caught the flickering glimmers of lightning as his spear found its mark time and time again. He was everywhere and nowhere, a force of nature that inspired his allies and struck fear into the hearts of the Fomorians. Yet even he could not be everywhere at once, and the tide of the battle shifted like a wild, unpredictable ocean. Then it came, the moment everyone had dreaded. Balor's great eye began to open, its lid heavy and slow, as if even the act of revealing such destruction required immense effort. Those who had faced it before and lived spoke of how it could scorch the earth, turn warriors to ash, and bring entire armies to their knees. A cry went up from the Tuatha De Danann as they tried to shield their eyes and brace themselves for the inevitable. Luff saw it. His eyes locked onto the hulking form of Balor, and in that instant, he knew what had to be done. With a determination that seemed to defy the very laws of the universe, he broke through the chaos, weaving between combatants with the precision of a hawk diving for its prey. His spear glinted in the dim light, a weapon forged for this very moment. Balor's eye fully opened, and the air around it shimmered with heat and malice. The ground beneath him began to blacken, and the cries of warriors turned to screams of agony. Luff leapt, his spear flying through the air like a comet. Time seemed to slow as it struck true, piercing Balor's eye and driving deep into his skull. The giant roared, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the heavens themselves. For a moment, the battlefield froze. Even the Fomorians, who had seemed invincible moments before, hesitated as their leader fell, his massive form crashing to the ground with an earth-shattering thud. The tide began to turn. But victory was not easily won. The Fomorians, enraged by the loss of their leader, fought with a desperation that made them even more dangerous. The Tuatha De Danann, though heartened by Luff's act of heroism, were weary, their ranks thinned, their strength nearly spent. The battle became a brutal slog, each side pushing the other to the brink. Amid the chaos, moments of heartbreak unfolded. Warriors fell clutching the hands of their comrades, their eyes filled with the pain of lives cut short. A mother fought fiercely to protect her son, only to fall herself, her sacrifice etched into the fabric of the battlefield. The land itself seemed to mourn, its once vibrant fields scarred and lifeless. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, the Fomorians began to falter. Without their leader, their cohesion crumbled, and their will to fight ebbed away. The Tuatha De Danann pushed forward with every ounce of strength they had left, driving their foes back toward the sea. When the last Fomorian fell, the battlefield fell silent. The warriors of the Tuatha De Danann stood amidst the ruins of what had once been a thriving land, their victory bittersweet. They had fought for their survival and won, but the cost was etched into every face, every blade, and every inch of the blood-soaked earth. Luff stood at the center, his spear still in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was hailed as a hero, yet his heart was heavy. He knew that battles like this were never truly over, that the scars they left behind would take generations to heal. But for now, the land was theirs, and the promise of a brighter future flickered like a fragile flame in the darkness. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the plain of Fiacra. The air carried a biting chill, not from the weather but from the oppressive tension that gripped the warriors gathered there. The ground was still, as if the earth itself held its breath, anticipating the carnage that was about to unfold. In the distance, the enemy loomed, a force so dark, so menacing, it seemed to blot out the horizon. At their head stood Balor of the Evil Eye, a figure of dread whose name alone was enough to drain the courage from lesser hearts. But Luff was not afraid. Standing at the forefront of the Tuatha De Danann, Luff's golden hair caught the light, gleaming like a beacon amidst the shadows. His gaze was fixed on Balor, unflinching and steady. This was no ordinary battle, and Luff knew it. This was a fight that would decide the fate of his people, a clash between life and annihilation, between hope and despair. The armies began to move, the silence shattered by the pounding of feet and the clash of weapons being readied for war. The roar of the Fomorian forces was like thunder, a deafening wave of sound that seemed to roll over the plain. The Tuatha De Danann stood their ground, their ranks tight, their faces hard with resolve. They were outnumbered, and the enemy was monstrous in both size and power, but they had something the Fomorians did not, Luff. As the two forces met, the plain erupted into chaos. The clang of swords on shields, the cries of the wounded, and the shouts of commanders created a cacophony that drowned out everything else. Blood stained the ground, turning the earth slick beneath the warriors' feet. In the thick of it all, Luff moved like a force of nature. He wielded his spear with a precision and grace that seemed almost impossible. Every strike found its mark, every movement was deliberate and deadly. He fought not just with skill, but with a purpose that burned brighter than the sun. His people were counting on him, and he would not fail them. Across the battlefield, Balor was a terror to behold. His massive frame towered over the chaos, his every step shaking the ground. He fought with the kind of ferocity that only a being born of destruction could muster. But it was his eye that everyone feared most, a weapon so devastating it could level mountains and incinerate armies with a single glance. And then it happened. Slowly, ominously, Balor began to lift the heavy lid of his great eye. The air around him seemed to shimmer and distort, as if the very fabric of reality was bending under the weight of his power. The warriors nearest to him screamed in agony as the first rays of his deadly gaze fell upon them. Luff saw it. He saw the destruction, the lives snuffed out in an instant, and he knew he had to act. Time seemed to slow as he broke through the melee, weaving through the chaos with a speed and agility that left even the Fomorian warriors stunned. His spear glinted in the dim light, its tip aimed directly at the source of the destruction. Balor's eye opened fully, and the world seemed to pause. The power radiating from it was unlike anything the battlefield had ever seen. The earth itself blackened and cracked under its gaze, the air filled with the acrid stench of burning. But Luff did not waver. He raised his spear, his heart pounding not with fear but with determination. With a cry that pierced the noise of the battlefield, Luff hurled his spear. It flew through the air like a comet, straight and true, and struck Balor's eye with a force that echoed across the plain. The impact was cataclysmic. Balor roared, a sound so loud and terrible it seemed to split the heavens. He stumbled, his massive form swaying as if the very ground beneath him was no longer stable. For a moment, it was as if the entire world held its breath. And then Balor fell. His colossal body hit the ground with an earth-shaking crash, the sound reverberating for miles. The Fomorian forces froze, their confidence shattered by the loss of their leader. The tide of the battle turned. But it was not over. The Fomorians, though leaderless, were still a formidable force, and they fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. The Tuatha De Danann, though weary and battered, rallied behind Luff, their spirits lifted by his incredible act of heroism. The battle dragged on, every moment more grueling than the last. Warriors fell on both sides, their cries of pain and defiance filling the air. Luff continued to fight, his spear now a symbol of hope for his people. He moved with purpose, cutting down enemies with a precision that was almost otherworldly. As the sun began to set, its light bathing the plain in a blood-red hue, the Fomorians finally began to retreat. Their will to fight had been broken, their ranks decimated. The Tuatha De Danann stood victorious, but the cost of that victory was etched into every face, every scar, every tear that fell. Luff stood amidst the aftermath, his spear still in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had done what no one else could, he had defeated Balor, the greatest threat his people had ever faced. Yet his heart was heavy. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of those who had fought and died for their land, their dreams, their families. The plain of Fiacra, once a place of life and beauty, was now a graveyard, a stark reminder of the price of war. Luff's victory was monumental, but it came at a cost that could never be forgotten. The echoes of that battle would linger, not just in the land, but in the hearts of those who survived. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the smell of smoke and fear. The walls of Emain Macha stood tall, their stone surfaces darkened by the siege that had lasted for weeks. The Ulaid had been a proud kingdom, one that had once known the power of victory, but now, the air was thick with the scent of defeat. Inside the stronghold, the warriors of the Ulaid stood in silence, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. They had fought long and hard, but the enemy outside, relentless and fierce, had brought them to the brink of ruin. The once great kingdom, known for its strength and honor, was now on the edge of falling. The drums of war echoed in the distance, the beat like the pulse of a dying heart. The enemy was closing in, tightening the noose around the Ulaid's last breath. Every day, the walls of Emain Macha grew weaker, the stones chipped away by the relentless onslaught. The gates, once a symbol of strength, were now trembling under the pressure of the enemy's siege weapons. Within the heart of the fortress, the leaders of the Ulaid gathered. Their faces were etched with lines of worry, their eyes heavy with the weight of leadership. It was a bitter truth, they could see the end was near. They had given everything they had, but nothing seemed enough to turn the tide. Among them stood Concobar Magnessa, the High King of the Ulaid. His eyes, once sharp with confidence, now reflected the strain of leadership in the face of certain destruction. He had always been a ruler of great strength, but now, in the quiet moments, he could hear the cries of the fallen warriors who had died under his watch. He could feel the weight of their sacrifice, and it pressed on him like 1,000 stones. "Is there any hope left?" one of his advisors asked, his voice breaking the silence. Concobar didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted to the cracks in the walls, the faint sounds of the enemy's footsteps echoing from beyond the gates. He knew the truth, they were outnumbered, outmatched, and out of time. The Ulaid's once glorious kingdom was crumbling, and with it, the legacy of his people. "Tell the men to prepare," Concobar finally said, his voice low but firm. "We will fight until the last." Outside, the enemy forces swarmed like a storm on the horizon. The Fomorians, led by the treacherous Queen Med, had come with vengeance in their hearts. They had seen the Ulaid as a threat, a kingdom whose power could no longer be allowed to exist. And now, they were determined to wipe it from the earth. As the battle raged outside the gates, the Ulaid fought with everything they had left. The clash of weapons, the roar of men, and the cries of the fallen filled the air. Yet despite their courage, the enemy's strength proved too much. The walls that had once stood so tall and proud were now being breached. The ground shook as the enemy's siege weapons tore through the stone, the fortress's defenses crumbling like sand. Inside the fortress, Concobar and his warriors did what they could to hold the line. They fought with the desperation of men who knew they had nothing left to lose. But with each passing hour, more and more of their people fell. The once immense walls were now nothing more than a crumbling shell, unable to withstand the weight of the invasion. Concobar could feel it. He could feel the kingdom slipping through his fingers. He had failed them. The people who had once revered him as their king, the warriors who had fought by his side, were now paying the price for his failures. The cries of the dying echoed in his ears, and his heart grew heavy with grief. Amidst the carnage, a single figure emerged from the enemy ranks. Mid, the queen of the Fomorians, stood tall and proud, her eyes gleaming with the triumph of conquest. She was the storm that had come to crush the Uleid, and she was not about to let anything stand in her way. Concobar's heart sank as he saw her. He knew what this meant. Mid would stop at nothing to claim victory, and the fall of Emain Macha would be her final, triumphant blow. The Uleid rallied one last time, charging toward the Fomorian queen. But their strength was no match for the force that Mid commanded. With a swift motion, she raised her sword high, and in that moment, Concobar knew the kingdom was lost. As Mid's blade came down, it was as though the world itself stopped. Time seemed to stretch, and in that instant, Concobar's mind flashed back to the days when Emain Macha had stood tall, when the laughter of his people had filled the halls, when he had been a king with the power to protect his people. Now, all that remained was destruction. With the fall of Emain Macha came the fall of the Uleid. The kingdom that had once been the pride of the land lay in ruin, its people scattered or slain. The walls that had once kept them safe now lay in ruins, their stones forever stained by the blood of the fallen. The great warriors of the Uleid, men and women who had fought with honor and strength, now joined the ancestors they had so often honored. In the aftermath of the battle, Concobar stood alone amidst the wreckage. The cries of the wounded and dying still echoed in his ears, but it was the silence that followed that cut deepest. The kingdom was gone, and with it, the dream of the Uleid's greatness. The ground beneath his feet felt cold and unforgiving, the weight of the loss pressing on him, a burden that no one could carry alone. Emain Macha had fallen. The rise and fall of the Uleid had come to an end, and with it, the end of an era. The stones of the fortress, now silent and broken, would remember the tragedy that had unfolded there. The legacy of the Uleid would live on only in the memories of those who had survived, and in the heartache of a king who had fought to the last. The sky was an angry gray, clouds swirling like dark omens over the waters of Loch Nee. The air hung heavy with the promise of something terrible, something that could not be avoided. From the shore, the sound of drums echoed across the lake, the rhythmic beat of an army that had gathered with one thing in mind, destruction. Yet there, standing in the shadows, watching it all unfold, was something even more terrifying than any enemy, the Morrigan. Her presence was known to all, a figure wrapped in the cloak of prophecy and doom. She had warned them. She had told them that this day would come, and now the time had arrived. The Morrigan's prophecy of destruction echoed in their hearts, a cold reminder of the fate that awaited them. There was no running from it, no escaping the doom that had been foretold. The armies were lined up, ready for battle, their faces grim with the knowledge that their lives might end on this very day. The warriors, hardened by years of conflict, gripped their weapons, but even they couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was different. The Morrigan's prophecy hovered over them like a shadow, and it was one that no shield or sword could protect them from. Far in the distance, the enemy army marched toward them, a sea of warriors intent on victory. Among them was their leader, a man whose heart burned with vengeance, determined to crush the forces of the Uleid once and for all. His soldiers followed him like a wave crashing toward the shore, knowing that the Morrigan had spoken the truth, that nothing could stop the tide of destruction that was coming. The Uleid were ready, standing firm as they waited for the clash. But there was no joy in their hearts, no pride in their stance. They fought not for glory, but for survival. The Morrigan had whispered her prophecy to them all, and now they understood it. This battle would not end with a victor. It would end with devastation, with death for both sides. As the armies moved closer, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the Morrigan herself, her black wings sweeping the ground like a dark storm. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, knowing that the bloodshed ahead was inevitable, but her heart was heavy with a knowledge that few could bear. The death of so many would weigh on her, but it was a fate she could not change. The air grew thick, the sound of the drums growing louder as the armies neared the lake's edge. A single bird cried out, the call hanging in the air like a morning song, the prelude to what was to come. The warriors felt it in their bones, the weight of the Morrigan's prophecy pressing down on them, urging them forward even as it whispered of their inevitable doom. The first clash of steel rang out, a sound that would haunt the minds of those who survived. The Ulaid fought with everything they had, with their pride and their honor, but it was as though the Morrigan herself had cursed them. The warriors were driven like cattle into a slaughterhouse, and no matter how many fell, the enemy came on with an unrelenting force. The battle raged on, the screams of the fallen drowned out by the clash of swords and the roar of battle. Blood stained the earth, and the once beautiful lake now reflected the horror of war. The Morrigan watched it all, her heart aching, knowing that the prophecy was being fulfilled. She could see it, the moment when the battle turned. It was a subtle shift, barely noticeable, but she could feel it in the air. The Ulaid were faltering, their strength ebbing away as the weight of the prophecy crushed them. The enemy, relentless and merciless, pressed forward, and with every step, the end drew closer. In the midst of it all, a warrior fell, one who had once been a hero, a leader among his people. He had fought bravely, but the Morrigan's curse was stronger than any man's will. His body hit the earth with a final thud, his life extinguished by the very forces that had driven him to this battle. His death marked the beginning of the end for the Ulaid. The battle continued, each blow struck with a sense of finality. The Morrigan's prophecy had not been wrong. The warriors fought with fury in their hearts, but it was as though the very world was against them, the earth itself betraying them with every step they took. No matter how many they killed, the enemy simply kept coming, as if they were fated to destroy everything in their path. With each passing moment, the sound of the battle grew fainter, until it was nothing more than a distant hum. The Morrigan stood on the shore of Loch Nee, her eyes closing as the blood of the fallen stained the ground around her. The prophecy had been fulfilled, and the price of their resistance had been paid in full. When the dust finally settled, the lake lay still. The sounds of battle had ceased, but the silence that followed was deafening. The Morrigan, her eyes filled with sorrow, knew that the world had changed forever. The Ulaid were no more. The prophecy had come true, and it had come at a terrible cost. The waters of Loch Nee, once a place of beauty and serenity, now stood as a silent witness to the death and destruction that had unfolded. The Morrigan's prophecy had been fulfilled, but at what price? The blood of the fallen lingered in the air, and the echo of their sacrifices would be felt for generations to come. The Morrigan, her task now complete, spread her wings and took to the sky. The winds howled as she soared above the battlefield, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had seen it all, the rise and fall of kings, the death of heroes, and the fulfillment of a prophecy that had never been in question. It was the way of the world, the cycle of life and death. And yet, as she flew into the darkness, there was no peace in her heart, only the cold certainty that war, like prophecy, would always come again. The Stone of Fate stood at the heart of the great temple, a massive, silent monument to the power of destiny. Its presence was undeniable, ancient, cracked, worn by the passage of countless years. Those who had come before had revered it, for it was said to hold the threads of all fates, weaving together the lives of gods and mortals alike. But today, that stone would be shattered. Luff, the bright and valiant hero, stood before the stone. His heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, but with the weight of a decision that could not be undone. His hand gripped his spear, the weapon that had carried him through many battles, yet today it felt heavier than ever before. His gaze was fixed on the stone, its surface etched with ancient runes, the power of fate itself resting beneath its cold, unyielding face. The air around him hummed with the energy of the moment. The prophecy had led him here, to this place, to this single, unalterable point in time. The gods had promised him a victory over the forces of darkness, but at what cost? For years, Luff had carried the weight of destiny on his shoulders. He had fought for the gods, for the people, for his land, but now, standing before the Stone of Fates, he realized that what he had fought for might not be what he truly wanted. The stone had always been a reminder that their lives were not their own, they were merely puppets, their strings pulled by the unseen forces of fate. His breath quickened as he raised his spear. A sharp, sudden pain sliced through him. Was it fear? Regret? No. It was something deeper. The stone was calling him, whispering the fate of every soul, the death of every hero, the fall of every kingdom. The gods had chosen him, but now he questioned their choice. Was this the path of honor? Or was it a path that led to his own destruction? Without another thought, he thrust the spear toward the Stone of Fates. The moment the tip made contact with the ancient stone, a deafening crack split the air, and the earth trembled beneath him. The stone shuddered, and for the briefest of moments, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, the stone shattered. It was as though the very fabric of reality had torn open, sending ripples through the world. The sky darkened, and thunder rumbled in the distance, the sound of the gods' fury. The Stone of Fates was no more, and with its destruction, the threads that had once bound all fates together were severed. Luff staggered back, his heart pounding as if it, too, had been shattered by the force of the blow. He felt the world shift beneath him, the weight of the consequences crashing into him like a tidal wave. The very air seemed to vibrate with a new, strange energy. The gods had promised him victory, but what did victory mean now? In the distance, he saw the storm clouds gathering, a whirlwind of dark power swirling above him. It was as if the destruction of the stone had unleashed something far darker than he had ever imagined. The gods had given him a choice, but the consequences of that choice were now clear. No longer bound by the stone, Luff was free. Free from fate. But was freedom truly a gift, or a curse? The wind howled around him, and Luff could feel the weight of every decision, every life, every sacrifice, pressing down on him. Was it worth it? To be free from destiny? Or had he unleashed something far worse upon the world? His mind raced, thoughts tangled like the broken threads of fate. As the storm grew stronger, a figure appeared from the swirling darkness, tall, draped in shadow, eyes glowing like embers in the night. It was the Morrigan, the goddess of fate and death, the very force he had defied. Her gaze met his, and he could feel the coldness in her eyes, the weight of her judgment. "You have shattered the stone," she said, her voice a whisper carried by the wind. "You have broken the thread of fate. Now, nothing will be the same." Luff stood frozen, his body trembling, the consequences of his actions slowly sinking in. The Morrigan's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and he could feel the weight of her gaze piercing through him. "You sought to break free," she continued, her voice both mournful and stern. "But fate cannot be escaped. It will find its way, one way or another." Her words rang in his ears, and for the first time, Luff felt the true depth of what he had done. He had sought to free himself from the chains of destiny, but in doing so, he had torn the world apart. The gods' power no longer held sway over the lives of mortals, and the lives of men were no longer guided by the invisible threads of fate. But what would replace it? What would rise from the ashes of the broken stone? The Morrigan stepped closer, her presence now overwhelming. "You have broken the stone," she repeated, her voice now full of bitterness. "But you have not freed yourself. You have only unleashed chaos." Luff wanted to speak, to defend his actions, but the weight of her words silenced him. He looked at the shattered remains of the stone, its pieces scattered across the ground like the broken fragments of a once unbreakable promise. The storm above them grew fiercer, the winds howling, the thunder crashing like a warning. The earth trembled beneath his feet. It was as though the world itself was mourning the loss of the stone, the loss of fate. And yet, in the back of his mind, a single, terrible thought echoed, "What have I done?" He had shattered the Stone of Fates, and with it, the very fabric of the world had been torn apart. The power of the gods, the delicate balance of life and death, the guiding force of destiny, all of it was now lost. The storm raged on, the winds growing wilder, the sky flashing with lightning. The Morrigan turned away, disappearing into the darkness as if she, too, had been consumed by the destruction. Luff stood alone, the weight of the world pressing down on him, knowing that the consequences of his actions had only just begun to unfold. The storm continued to rage, and the winds whispered the story of Luff, the hero who had shattered fate, and in doing so, had shattered everything. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and blood, the ground trembling beneath the weight of countless warriors. The final battle had begun, and the world seemed to hold its breath as the armies of the Tuatha De Danann faced their ancient foes, the Fomorians. It was a battle that would decide the fate of the land, the gods, and every living soul. Luff, the shining hero of the Tuatha De Danann, stood at the front, his eyes fixed on the vast, dark army that stretched across the plain. The Fomorians had come in full force, their twisted forms a stark contrast to the beauty of the land they sought to destroy. Their battle cries filled the air, a terrifying sound that sent shivers through the hearts of all who heard it. Yet, despite the fear that gripped his heart, Luff stood tall. He had led his people through countless battles, but this one would be different. His sword, a gleaming blade forged by the gods themselves, felt heavy in his hand. Every swing, every strike would be a decision that could change everything. He glanced over at his comrades, the warriors of the Tuatha De Danann, each one ready to fight and die for their people. They were a proud and noble race, their bloodline traced to the gods themselves. But even they could not deny the weight of the moment. This battle, the final clash between light and darkness, would be the end of an era. As the two armies faced off, the sky above seemed to darken, the clouds swirling with the promise of destruction. The Fomorians, led by their monstrous king, Balor, loomed like a storm on the horizon. His single, terrible eye was said to have the power to turn men to stone with a single glance, and his army was as vicious and merciless as the gods of destruction themselves. Luffa's heart beat faster, but his resolve was unshakable. This was it. This was the moment he had trained for, fought for, lived for. The fate of the world rested on his shoulders and the shoulders of his warriors. There was no turning back now. The first clash came like a thunderclap. The earth shook as the two armies collided with a deafening roar. Steel rang against steel, the cries of the wounded and dying filling the air. Luffa's blade cut through the Fomorian ranks, each strike a burst of light in the sea of darkness. His warriors fought with him, their strength and courage unmatched. Yet, despite their power, the Fomorians pushed forward with a relentless fury, their twisted forms unyielding, their minds consumed with hatred and rage. As the battle raged on, Luff could feel the weight of his people's hopes pressing down on him. His comrades, his friends, were falling all around him. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the cries of the fallen echoed through the battlefield. Each breath he took felt heavier than the last, and yet, he pressed on. He couldn't stop now. Not when everything he loved was at stake. The sky above darkened further, the clouds swirling into a vortex of anger and power. From the center of the Fomorian army, Balor emerged, his monstrous form towering over the battlefield. His eye, a burning pit of hatred and malice, glowed with an unearthly power. The moment his gaze fell upon the Tuatha De Danann, a sense of dread washed over the land. It was said that his eye could bring death with a single glance, and Luff knew that the only way to win this battle was to take down the Fomorian king. Luff fought his way through the chaos, his heart pounding in his chest. His sword, gleaming with divine light, cut through the darkness, but even his strength seemed small in the face of Balor's power. The ground beneath his feet shook as the Fomorian king approached, his eye fixed on Luff like a predator stalking its prey. Luff could feel the weight of that gaze, the crushing power of it, and for a moment, fear surged through him. But then, something inside him shifted. This was his moment. He had fought for this. He had trained for this. And he would not let the darkness win. With a roar, Luff charged forward, his sword raised high. The moment he drew near, Balor turned his terrible eye upon him, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. Luff could feel the weight of the gaze, the terrible power that could turn him to stone with a single glance. But he did not falter. In a blur of motion, Luff struck. His sword cleaved through the air, and in that moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The battle, the war, the centuries of conflict, all of it was reduced to this single moment. Luff's blade struck Baelor's eye, the force of the blow causing a deafening crack to echo across the battlefield. For a moment, there was silence. And then, Baelor's terrible cry of pain split the air, a sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. His eye, the source of his power, exploded in a shower of molten light. The Fomorian king staggered back, his monstrous form collapsing as his army faltered, their strength lost without their leader. Luff stood tall, his chest heaving with the effort of his strike. The battlefield had fallen silent, the cries of war fading into the background. The Tuatha De Danann had won. The Fomorians were broken, their power shattered by the fall of their king. But even in the midst of victory, Luff felt the weight of the cost. So many lives had been lost. His friends, his comrades, had given everything in this fight. The price of victory had been high, and the field was littered with the fallen. The once beautiful land was stained with blood, and the silence that followed the battle was heavy with grief. Luff stood in the midst of the wreckage, his sword still gripped tightly in his hand. The battle was won, but the cost would haunt him forever. His people were safe, for now, but at what cost? The weight of the lives lost pressed on him, and though he had defeated the Fomorians, he could not escape the feeling that something, somewhere, had been broken. The final battle was over. But the scars of war would linger for generations to come. The wind howled across the battlefield, carrying with it the scent of earth, iron, and something far worse, death. The sound of clashing swords and the cries of fallen warriors rang through the air, each one adding to the mournful symphony of the battle. It was the final confrontation, the last stand of a king who had seen the rise and fall of countless battles, but never one quite like this. The Druid king stood tall at the heart of the chaos, his robes flowing behind him like the last remnants of an era long gone. His face was withered, his eyes darkened with wisdom and sorrow. For years, he had watched over his people, guided them with knowledge of the old ways, and protected them from the darkness that threatened to engulf their world. But today, it was all falling apart. Today, everything he had fought for would either rise or crumble under the weight of war. The ground beneath his feet was slick with the blood of fallen soldiers, their lives cut short in a conflict they had no choice but to fight. The once beautiful plains of Math Moor had become a wasteland of twisted metal, broken shields, and the bodies of the dead. The air was thick with the acrid smoke of burning villages, the remnants of a once thriving kingdom now reduced to ashes. And yet, the Druid king did not falter. He could feel the power of the earth beneath him, the ancient magic flowing through his veins. The stones, the trees, the winds, they were all with him, and he would not let his people's sacrifice be in vain. With every step, he drew on the ancient power that had been passed down through the ages. His heart beat in rhythm with the pulse of the earth, and for a moment, he felt invincible. But the enemy was relentless. The invaders, fueled by greed and hatred, pressed on without mercy. Their swords cut through the ranks of the king's warriors, their cries of triumph rising above the clash of steel. The Druid king's own warriors, brave and noble, fought with all the might they had, but even they could not hold the line forever. They were outnumbered, and their strength was fading with each passing minute. Through the smoke and the chaos, the Druid king saw him, the enemy leader, a man whose face was twisted with the same darkness that had driven this war. The invader's eyes were cold, devoid of any mercy or compassion. He was a king, yes, but a king who had long lost his humanity, consumed by the thirst for power. He rode upon a black steed, his sword gleaming with the promise of death, and his army surged forward like a wave, unstoppable, overwhelming. The Druid king's heart tightened. He knew this was the moment. If he did not stop this leader now, all would be lost. But how? His body ached with exhaustion, his strength waning, and yet his will was as strong as ever. He could feel the magic within him, ancient and powerful, but even that seemed to be fading, worn thin from years of struggle and battle. With a final, defiant roar, the Druid king surged forward, his staff raised high. The air around him crackled with the energy of the earth itself. He called upon the spirits of the land, the old gods of the forest and the sky, the ancestors who had fought before him. In that moment, the earth seemed to respond, the ground trembling beneath his feet, the sky darkening with the weight of his magic. The enemy leader, seeing the Druid king approach, spurred his horse forward, his sword raised to strike. The two kings clashed in the center of the battlefield, their swords meeting with a force that shook the very ground beneath them. The Druid king felt the power of the enemy's strike, a blow that would have felled any other man. But not him. Not today. With a cry of fury, the Druid king thrust his staff into the earth, summoning the ancient magic of the land itself. The ground beneath them erupted, a great chasm opening up between them, swallowing the enemy leader's steed and throwing him to the earth. The two kings faced each other, their eyes locked in a battle of wills, each determined to emerge victorious. But the Druid king knew this was the final moment. The magic of the earth, the wind, the sky, it was all with him, but it would cost him everything. His life, his power, his legacy, everything he had built would be reduced to dust if he did not act now. With a final, desperate cry, the Druid king channeled every last ounce of his strength, every ounce of his magic. The land around him responded, the earth shaking as if in pain, the very sky darkening with the weight of his power. His staff glowed with a bright, blinding light, and in that moment, he knew what had to be done. He thrust his staff forward, calling upon the earth's power to crush his enemies once and for all. The ground beneath them split open, a great chasm consuming everything in its path. The invaders screamed as they were swallowed by the earth, their cries of terror fading into nothingness. But even as the enemy fell, the Druid king's strength failed him. His body, weakened by the years of battle and magic, gave way. He collapsed to his knees, his staff falling from his hand. The earth seemed to mourn with him, the once vibrant magic fading into silence. As the battlefield fell silent, the Druid king lay there, his eyes closing for the final time. His warriors, those who had survived, gathered around him, their hearts heavy with sorrow. They had won, yes, but at a terrible cost. The land was safe, but the price of that safety had been high. The Druid king had given everything, his life, his magic, his people, for the promise of a future that would never come. And as the sun began to set over the battlefield, the world seemed to mourn with him. The last of the great Druids, the last of the kings who had protected the land, was gone. And all that remained was the silence of the earth, a silent testament to the price of victory. The air was thick with tension, as though the land itself could feel the weight of the impending storm. Across the field, under the fading light of a setting sun, warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, their hearts pounding in anticipation. The ground was damp beneath their boots, and a strange silence hung in the air, an eerie calm before the chaos that was about to unfold. On one side, the Celts, proud and fierce, their eyes burning with the fire of their ancestors. On the other, the enemy, determined to crush everything the Celts had fought to preserve. It was the battle of the cradle, the moment when the fate of a people would be decided. Every warrior knew that this battle would not be like the others. This was the one that would either secure the future of the Celts or destroy it completely. And they were ready to face whatever came. In the distance, the sound of war drums began to echo through the valley, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to shake the very earth. The warriors felt it in their bones, the call to arms, a sound that spoke of both the promise of victory and the agony of defeat. For the Celts, this was not just a battle. It was the struggle for everything that defined them, their lands, their beliefs, their very existence. It was the struggle for the fate of their people. At the front of the Celtic lines, a leader stood tall, his face etched with determination. His name was known throughout the land, a warrior of unmatched skill, a symbol of hope to his people. But today, his heart was heavy. He knew that this battle was more than just about weapons and strength. It was about something far greater, something that could not be measured in blood or in the number of fallen enemies. It was the battle for the soul of his people. His eyes scanned the battlefield, searching for something, anything, that would give him a glimmer of hope. But all he saw was the sea of enemies closing in, their numbers overwhelming. His heart ached for the ones who had already fallen, the ones whose sacrifices had paved the way for this moment. The pain of loss, the weight of leadership, the responsibility of every life on this battlefield, it was almost too much to bear. And then, he saw it, a flash of movement on the horizon, a signal. His breath caught in his throat. The enemy was about to strike. The first wave came crashing down upon them like a tidal wave, the clash of metal against metal ringing in the air. The leader shouted a rallying cry, and his warriors surged forward, swords raised high. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the battle began in earnest. The Celts fought with the fury of lions, their warriors charging forward with all the strength and passion they had, but it was not enough. The enemy was relentless, their numbers endless. Each strike from the enemy was met with a defiant blow from the Celts, but with every blow, a life was lost. The air was thick with smoke, the stench of sweat and blood, and the cries of the dying. The sounds of battle echoed across the land, each one a reminder of what was at stake. Through the chaos, the leader fought on, his every movement a blur of strength and skill. He could feel the weight of his people's hopes and dreams pressing down on him with every step. His blade cut through enemy lines, each swing of his sword a testament to the love he had for his people, for his land. But even he could see it, the tide was turning. The Celts were losing ground, their strength faltering, their numbers thinning. He caught sight of the enemy general, a towering figure who seemed to exude malice with every step. His eyes were cold, unfeeling, and the leader knew that this was the man who would bring about their destruction if he was allowed to live. With a primal roar, he fought his way through the chaos, carving a path toward his enemy. His heart pounded in his chest, and the battle around him seemed to fade away, all his focus narrowing to the confrontation ahead. But as he neared the general, something unexpected happened. The battlefield seemed to shift, as though time itself slowed. For a brief moment, he saw the faces of his fallen warriors, their eyes full of pain and regret, their bodies broken. Their spirits seemed to call out to him, urging him to do more, to fight harder, to give everything. The weight of their sacrifices pressed down on him, threatening to crush him beneath its intensity. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he pushed through, determined to honor those who had given their lives for this fight. With a final, desperate charge, he reached the enemy general, their swords clashing with a resounding boom that seemed to echo across the battlefield. The two warriors were locked in a battle of wills, neither giving an inch, each one fighting for everything they held dear. The leader's body ached, every strike sending waves of pain through him, but he refused to stop. He could feel the strength of his ancestors flowing through him, the power of the land, the power of the people he fought for. And with one final, mighty blow, he drove his sword into the heart of the enemy general, ending the fight once and for all. But the victory came at a price. The moment the enemy general fell, the ground beneath the leader's feet seemed to tremble, the air thick with the weight of the battle's cost. His warriors, those who remained, were too few, their strength drained from the prolonged fight. They had won, yes, but at what cost? The land they fought to protect was scarred, their people shattered. And the leader knew, deep in his heart, that the true battle was just beginning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final, mournful light over the battlefield, the leader stood alone, his sword dripping with the blood of his enemies and his people. His body was broken, but his spirit remained unbowed. The battle for the fate of the Celts had been won, but the cost of victory would haunt them all forever. And as the cries of the fallen echoed in the night, the leader vowed to rebuild, to honor the sacrifices made, and to ensure that the legacy of the Celts would live on for generations to come. The roar of the river echoed in the valley, carrying with it the cries of warriors, the clash of metal, and the unmistakable scent of blood. It was the kind of battle that would change the course of a lifetime. On the banks of the three rivers, the air was thick with anticipation, and the tension could be felt in every beat of the heart. Finn Mac Cumhale, the legendary leader of the Fianna, stood at the edge of the river, his gaze fixed on the enemy ahead. His hand gripped the hilt of his sword, the very weapon that had brought him countless victories. Yet today, something felt different. Today, it was not the wind beneath his wings, but a storm gathering in his heart. He had seen countless battles, had won many victories, and led his men with unmatched bravery. His name was known across the land, and his enemies feared him. But there, before him, on the banks of the three rivers, lay the battle that would test everything he had ever known. And this time, there was no guarantee of triumph. The opposing forces stretched out in front of him, an unyielding wall of soldiers, their eyes cold and hungry for the blood of the Fianna. They had come for one thing and one thing only, to crush the mighty Finn and his warriors. The moment was heavy with an unspoken truth. This would be the battle that defined their fates, and perhaps, the fate of the entire land. But even in the face of certain danger, Finn stood tall, unshaken. He knew what was at stake. His men had fought beside him through countless wars, each of them loyal to the last. And he would not let them fall. As the battle horn sounded, the calm before the storm shattered, and the world erupted into chaos. The clash of swords rang through the air, echoing off the trees and the riverbanks. Finn moved with a grace that only a warrior of his caliber could possess. His sword slashed through the air, cutting down his enemies with swift, decisive strikes. But as he fought, his mind was clouded. He could feel the weight of responsibility bearing down on him. His warriors, his friends, he couldn't afford to let them fall. Not today. But as the battle raged on, something began to shift. The enemy seemed to be everywhere, their numbers overwhelming. The Fianna, once so strong, were beginning to falter. They were not prepared for the sheer ferocity of the enemy's assault. Finn could see the men around him growing tired, their movements slower, their resolve weakening. He could hear the screams of his warriors as they were struck down one by one. It was then, in the midst of the chaos, that Finn felt it, the unmistakable pull of fate. He had always been a warrior, always a leader, always the one to carry the weight of others. But today, something was different. He felt the weight of every man who had fallen before him, every life that had been lost, and every soul that cried out for justice. The anger and the fear twisted within him, threatening to overtake him, but he fought to stay in control. He could not let the darkness consume him, not when so many depended on him. Then, in the midst of the battle, it happened. A single figure broke through the chaos. Tall, imposing, and with eyes like fire, the leader of the enemy forces approached. Finn knew him immediately. This was no ordinary warrior, this was the man who would end it all. The man who would bring about Finn's greatest defeat. The two warriors locked eyes, and for a brief moment, the noise of the battle seemed to fade away. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, and there was only Finn and his foe. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and he could feel the loss of his warriors in his bones. It was not just his life at stake now, it was theirs. Finn lunged forward, his sword raised high. The battle cry tore from his lips, and with all the strength he could muster, he struck. But his enemy was quicker, his blade moving like lightning, striking with deadly precision. The two warriors clashed again and again, each blow ringing out, louder than the last. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble with the force of their combat. And then, in one swift motion, Finn's sword was knocked from his hand. His breath caught in his throat as he stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt so vulnerable, so powerless. The weight of his failure began to settle over him, and he could feel his strength waning. The enemy stood over him, his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. Finn knew then that this was the end. This was the moment when everything he had fought for, everything he had built, would crumble. But even as his world shattered around him, he refused to let go. He refused to surrender. With a final, desperate cry, he lunged forward, his hands gripping the enemy's armor, his fingers curling around the last vestiges of hope. But it was no use. The battle was lost. His men were lost. As Finn fell to his knees, the battle around him continued to rage. He could hear the screams of his warriors, their cries ringing in his ears. But it wasn't the screams that haunted him, it was the silence that followed. The silence of defeat. The silence of a hero who had given everything, and still, it wasn't enough. He could feel the life draining from him, the weight of his final breath pressing down on him. And in those final moments, as the darkness closed in, Finn thought of his men, of his people, of the future they would never see. He had failed them. And that failure would be the legacy he left behind. But even as his vision blurred and the battle faded into nothingness, he knew one thing: his story, the story of the Fianna, would never be forgotten. The Battle of the Three Rivers would be remembered not for the victory that never came, but for the man who had fought with everything he had, even when the odds were stacked against him. The man who, in the end, gave everything for his people. And as Finn Mac Cumhaill lay in the dirt, his body broken and his spirit shattered, his name would live on, carried by the winds and the waters, forever a symbol of courage, of hope, and of the price of heroism. The rain fell in relentless sheets, mingling with the blood that stained the once proud banners of the Celtic kingdoms. The wind howled like a mourning mother, carrying the cries of warriors and the whispers of fate. Under the darkened skies, kings and heroes stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces carved with the weight of knowing. This was no ordinary battle, this was the end of an era. Beneath the tattered standards, the mightiest among them gathered for what they knew would be their final stand. The battlefield stretched before them, a wasteland of mud and despair. They had fought countless wars, claimed endless victories, but none of that mattered now. The enemy that loomed ahead was not just an opposing force, it was the shadow of change, the harbinger of their destruction. King Ewan of the southern lands gripped his sword tightly, the hilt trembling in his hands. He was no stranger to war, but this fight felt like a noose tightening around his kingdom. His gaze shifted to the men around him, warriors who had pledged their lives to his crown. Among them stood Cian, the famed hero whose name was sung in every hall. Cian had felled giants and wrestled beasts, but tonight, even he looked mortal. His piercing eyes held not just determination but a hint of sorrow, as though he could already see the tragedy unfolding. The first clash came like thunder, a deafening roar of steel meeting steel. The air grew thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and death. Ewan charged into the fray, his battle cry echoing like a beacon of hope for his people. His sword danced with precision, cutting through enemies with the fury of a man who knew he had nothing left to lose. But no matter how many foes fell, more seemed to rise from the earth, an endless tide against which the Celts had no defense. In the heart of the chaos, Cian fought like a lion cornered, his blade flashing as he protected those around him. His movements were poetry in motion, a reminder of the legends that had been built around his name. Yet even he began to falter. An arrow grazed his shoulder, then another found its mark in his thigh. He pressed on, teeth gritted, his strength draining with each step. It was as if the land itself mourned for him, the ground shaking beneath his feet as though it, too, knew it was losing one of its finest. Ewan and Cian found themselves back to back, the tide of enemies pressing closer. This is not how it ends. Ewan roared, though his voice cracked under the strain of desperation. Cian didn't respond, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but his silence spoke louder than words. He knew the truth, they both did. On the ridge above them, another king fell. Ed, the proud ruler of the Western Plains, was struck down by a spear that pierced his chest. His death was swift, but the sight of his lifeless body sent shockwaves through the Celtic forces. A wail of grief tore through the battlefield, a collective cry for a leader who had fought with honor and ruled with wisdom. His men hesitated, their courage wavering as they saw their king crumble to the earth. And in that moment of hesitation, the enemy surged forward. The losses mounted with every passing minute. Heroes who had once been invincible now lay broken in the mud, their weapons slipping from lifeless fingers. Warriors who had stood unshaken for years now faltered, their shields splintered, their spirits crushed. It was not just a battle they were losing, it was their legacy, their very way of life. Ewan fell to one knee, his strength nearly spent. Blood streamed down his face from a wound on his temple, but he refused to yield. He looked around at the chaos, the shattered remnants of the kingdoms he had sworn to protect. And then his eyes found Cian, who stood like a solitary flame in the darkness. The hero's armor was battered, his sword broken, but his resolve burned brighter than ever. Cian turned to Ewan, his voice steady despite the carnage. "We may fall, but we will not be forgotten." With those words, Cian surged forward, a final act of defiance against the inevitable. He charged into the enemy lines, his war cry piercing through the noise like a dagger. For a moment, It was as though time stood still, all eyes drawn to the lone figure who refused to bow. He fought with every ounce of strength left in his body, his broken sword a symbol of unyielding determination. But even legends cannot fight forever. A spear found its mark, piercing Kian's chest. He stumbled, his eyes wide with shock, and then he fell. The earth seemed to shudder beneath him as if grieving for its fallen son. Yuan watched in horror, his own breath catching as he saw the light fade from Kian's eyes. Around them, the battlefield grew quieter, the resistance fading as more kings and heroes met their end. Yuan rose to his feet, a final surge of determination driving him forward. He fought like a man possessed, each swing of his sword a tribute to those who had fallen. But even he could not hold back the tide. A blade struck him from behind, and he fell to his knees, his vision blurring. As the enemy forces closed in, the Celtic warriors scattered, their spirits broken. The banners of the kingdoms lay trampled in the mud, their colors dulled by blood and rain. The kings were gone, the heroes silenced, and the great Celtic kingdoms lay in ruin. The battlefield grew silent at last, the echoes of the fallen carried away by the wind. And yet, in that silence, there was something more. It was not just the end of an era, but the beginning of a memory that would live on in songs and stories, in the hearts of those who would never forget. For though the kings and heroes had fallen, their spirit endured, an unbreakable thread woven into the fabric of time. The battlefield was quiet now, the clash of swords replaced by the whisper of the wind. The ground, once alive with the fury of battle, was now still, heavy with the weight of what had been lost. Bodies lay scattered across the plain, warriors frozen in their final moments of courage and defiance. The air hung thick with the scent of blood and smoke, a bitter reminder of the cost of their struggle. A lone woman walked among the fallen, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hair was wild, streaked with dirt and grief, and her eyes carried the weight of countless tears yet to be shed. She knelt beside a young man whose face was still twisted in defiance, his sword broken in his lifeless hand. Gently, she placed a sprig of heather on his chest and whispered his name, her voice trembling. It was not just the name of a warrior she spoke, it was the name of a son, a brother, a husband. All around her, others began to emerge, their faces etched with sorrow and resolve. They came not to fight but to honor. The women carried cloths and herbs, their hands steady despite the trembling of their hearts. The men bore wooden stretchers, their shoulders hunched under the weight of grief. Together, they began the solemn task of gathering the dead. Each warrior was treated with care, their bodies washed and wounds cleaned as if to erase the violence that had stolen them away. Their weapons were laid beside them, symbols of their bravery and sacrifice. The silence was broken only by the murmurs of the living, voices weaving prayers and laments that rose into the cold evening air. At the edge of the field, a great fire was built, its flames reaching toward the darkening sky. The Druids, clad in robes that seemed to carry the whispers of the ancients, stood in a circle around it. Their chants began low, a rumble that resonated deep within the hearts of all who heard it. The words were old, older than memory, and they spoke of honor, of courage, of the journey beyond. One by one, the bodies were carried to the fire. Families and comrades gathered close, their hands clutching each other as though to anchor themselves against the rising tide of sorrow. For each warrior, a story was told, a tale of their deeds, their victories, their loves. The words were not grand or poetic, they were simple and true, spoken from hearts that refused to let their memories fade. A mother stood to speak of her son, her voice steady even as her tears fell freely. "He was my light," she said, her hands clutching the edge of her shawl. "When he was born, I knew he was meant for greatness. And now he is with the ancestors, where he belongs." A warrior knelt before the body of his brother, his head bowed. He said nothing, but the silence spoke volumes. He placed a small carving of a wolf beside the body, a token of their shared childhood, a promise that even in death, they would not be separated. As the night deepened, the flames grew higher, consuming the bodies and carrying their spirits into the stars. The Druids' chants grew louder, their voices rising in unison with the crackling of the fire. It was a sound both haunting and beautiful, a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the departed. When the fire had burned low, the ashes were carefully gathered. Some were scattered across the battlefield, so the warriors could forever be one with the land they had fought to protect. Others were placed in urns, to be taken home and kept as sacred relics. Each act was performed with reverence, a final gesture of love and respect. At dawn, the people gathered one last time. The sky was streaked with shades of gold and crimson, as if even the heavens mourned. A harpist began to play, the melody soft and mournful, weaving through the crowd like a thread binding them together. The song was one of remembrance, of longing, of hope. It spoke of a time when the warriors would rise again, their spirits reborn in the hearts of those who carried their memory. Children, too young to understand the full weight of the loss, clung to their mothers and fathers. Their small voices joined the lament, their innocence a fragile beacon against the darkness. They would grow up hearing the tales of this day, the names of the fallen etched into their minds like a sacred mantra. They would learn to honor the sacrifice, to carry the legacy forward. As the people began to leave, their faces were a mixture of sorrow and determination. They knew the cost of what had been lost, but they also knew the importance of holding on to what remained. The land itself seemed to breathe with them, its hills and valleys carrying the stories of the fallen. A young girl lingered by the ashes, her small hand clutching a flower she had picked earlier. She knelt and placed it among the remnants of the fire, her lips moving in a silent prayer. She didn't know the names of those who had fallen, but she felt their presence, their courage, their love for the land that had shaped them. And so, the mourning continued, not just for a day or a week, but for a lifetime. The rituals became stories, the stories became songs, and the songs became part of the very fabric of their existence. The warriors were gone, but they were not forgotten. They lived on in the hearts of their people, in the soil of their homeland, and in the stars that watched over them. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the soft rustle of the wind through the ancient oaks. In the distance, the moon hung low, its silver light bathing the hilltop in an otherworldly glow. There, on the sacred mound, the hero stood, his battle-worn armor glinting faintly under the moon's watchful gaze. His breaths were slow and deliberate, as though he could sense the weight of what was to come. The air seemed alive, humming with a presence that was not of this world. A faint mist coiled at his feet, twisting and shifting as if it had a mind of its own. The hero's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, not in readiness for battle, but in a gesture of farewell. He gazed toward the horizon, where the edges of the mortal world began to blur, and whispered a name only the stars seemed to understand. The first sign was a soft sound, almost like a sigh, carried on the wind. Then, the sky above began to ripple, as if the very fabric of reality was being drawn back. A doorway appeared, its edges shimmering like liquid gold, pulsating with a rhythm that seemed to echo the hero's heartbeat. He took a step forward, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, as though reluctant to let him go. Figures emerged from the light, ethereal and radiant. They were not bound by the rules of flesh and bone, they moved like flowing water, their forms both solid and intangible. These were not ordinary beings, they were the guides of the otherworld, sent to escort the hero to a place beyond the reach of mortal men. Their presence was both comforting and awe-inspiring, and even the bravest warrior might have trembled in their shadow. The hero's steps faltered for a moment. He turned back, his eyes scanning the familiar lands he had fought to protect. He saw the rivers he had crossed, the forests where he had hunted, the villages where laughter and life had thrived. He saw faces, those of comrades who had fallen, their voices now a distant memory, and those of the living, who carried the weight of the future. A pang of sorrow gripped him, but it was tempered by a quiet acceptance. His time here was done. The mist thickened, rising like a tide, and the figures beckoned him forward. Their voices were like music, each note resonating with a truth too profound for words. They spoke of rest, of renewal, of a place where heroes were not bound by the trials of mortality. The hero felt his weariness begin to lift, the aches of his wounds fading like a forgotten dream. He stepped into the light, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The other world was unlike anything he could have imagined. It was not a single place, but a living, breathing tapestry of beauty and wonder. The rivers sparkled like liquid crystal, their currents weaving melodies that seemed to seep into his soul. The trees towered high, their branches stretching into the heavens, bearing fruit that glowed with an inner light. The air was thick with the scent of flowers, their petals shimmering in colors unknown to mortal eyes. He was not alone. Other heroes walked these lands, their faces serene, their burdens lifted. They greeted him with smiles, their eyes shining with a shared understanding. Here, there was no need for words. Every glance, every gesture, carried the weight of 1,000 stories. The hero felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of belonging he had never known. A figure stepped forward, one whose presence seemed to command the very air around them. Their gaze met his, and in that moment, the hero saw everything: the battles fought, the lives saved, the sacrifices made. There was no judgment, no questioning, only a quiet recognition of all that had been endured. The figure extended a hand, and the hero took it, feeling a surge of strength and peace. He was led to a great hall, its walls carved from the bones of the earth, its roof a canopy of stars. The hall was filled with light, not from torches or fire, but from the spirits of the heroes who gathered there. They feasted, not out of hunger, but in celebration of life and its many triumphs. Their laughter rang out, pure and unrestrained, a sound that seemed to heal the very fabric of his being. The hero took his place among them, his heart lighter than it had ever been. He raised a cup filled with an elixir that sparkled like starlight, and as he drank, he felt the weight of his mortal life fall away. The memories of pain and loss were not erased but transformed, becoming part of a greater tapestry that stretched beyond time and space. In the distance, he could hear the songs of the bards, carried on the wind from the world he had left behind. They sang of his deeds, his courage, his love for his people. The words reached him, a bridge between the mortal and the eternal, and he smiled. He knew that as long as the songs were sung, he would never truly be gone. The night stretched on, timeless and infinite, as the hero embraced his new existence. The other world was not an end, but a beginning, a place where the essence of what he had been could grow and flourish. He felt no fear, no regret, only a profound gratitude for the life he had lived and the path he had chosen. The doorway to the mortal world remained open for a moment longer, the light flickering like a candle in the wind. Then, with a final, gentle sigh, it closed, leaving only the stars to bear witness to what had passed. The hero's name would be spoken for generations to come, his story woven into the very fabric of his people's history. And in the other world, he would stand as a guardian, a beacon of hope for those who came after. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if they, too, honored the hero who had ascended. The air was still, unnaturally so, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The sun hovered low on the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the ancient battlefield. The land bore the scars of long-forgotten wars, cracked stones, broken weapons, and patches of earth that would never again bear life. Yet, amidst this desolation, there was a stirring, faint but undeniable, like the whisper of a heartbeat buried deep within the soil. The old Druids had spoken of this moment in hushed tones, their words laden with reverence and fear. They had told of kings who would rise again, of heroes who would walk the earth once more when their people were most in need. For centuries, the stories had been dismissed as mere legend, the kind of tales spun by firelight to comfort those afraid of what lay in the dark. But now, in the eerie quiet of the dusk, the earth itself seemed to hum with the truth of those ancient words. It began with a crack, a single, sharp sound that echoed across the empty plain. Then, another. The ground trembled, shaking loose the stones and revealing something beneath. From the fissures, a light emerged, soft at first, like the glow of a distant star. It grew brighter, spilling out in waves that seemed to chase away the gloom. The battlefield, once a place of death and despair, was now bathed in an otherworldly radiance. From the light, figures began to take shape. They rose slowly, as if emerging from a deep slumber, their forms cloaked in the shimmering essence of the otherworld. These were not mere men, they were the kings and warriors of old, their presence commanding and eternal. Their eyes, glowing like embers, held the weight of countless lifetimes. Their armor gleamed, unblemished by the passage of time, and their swords seemed to hum with a power that defied understanding. Among them was a figure taller than the rest, his bearing regal and unyielding. His face was etched with lines that spoke of wisdom and sorrow, and his hands rested on the hilt of a sword that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. This was no ordinary king, this was the High King, the one whose name had been whispered in prayers and songs for generations. His gaze swept over the land, taking in its brokenness, its beauty, and its need. The kings did not speak, but their presence was enough. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the sound of distant drums. The stars above seemed to shimmer in recognition, as if bowing to these returned heroes. The world, once fractured and weary, felt alive again, as though it had been waiting for this very moment. The people who had gathered at the edge of the plain watched in awe, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had come with offerings, flowers, weapons, and tokens of love and loyalty, unsure if their prayers would ever be answered. Now, faced with the impossible, they fell to their knees, tears streaming down their faces. Some reached out, their hands trembling, as though trying to grasp the reality of what they were seeing. One boy, no older than 10, stepped forward. His small frame shook with a mixture of fear and wonder, but his eyes were fixed on the High King. Clutched in his hand was a simple wooden carving of a sword, rough and unpolished. He held it out, his voice trembling as he spoke. "You've come back. Will you save us?" The High King knelt before the boy, his expression softening. He took the wooden sword in his hands, holding it as though it were the most precious thing in the world. "It is not I who will save you," he said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the weight of ages. "It is you, and all who have the courage to stand. But we will stand with you." The boy's face lit up, his fear replaced by a fierce determination. The crowd behind him surged forward, emboldened by the king's words. They reached for the hands of the resurrected heroes, not out of desperation, but out of hope. For the first time in years, they believed that change was possible, that the shadows that had gripped their land could be driven away. The kings and warriors moved among them, their presence a balm to weary souls. They laid their hands on the sick and the wounded, their touch bringing strength and healing. They whispered words of encouragement to the frightened and the grieving, their voices carrying the promise of better days. Each action, each gesture, seemed to stitch the fabric of the world back together, one thread at a time. As the night deepened, the kings gathered once more on the hilltop, their figures silhouetted against the brilliant glow of the otherworld's light. The High King raised his sword, its blade catching the starlight and reflecting it across the plain. The crowd fell silent, their breath caught in their throats. The king's voice rang out, strong and unwavering, a clarion call that seemed to reach into the hearts of all who heard it. "Tonight, we rise together. Not as kings and subjects, but as one people, bound by the blood of our ancestors and the hope of our future. The battles ahead will not be easy, but we will face them with courage and honor. For we are not defeated. We are not forgotten. And we will not fall." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising like a tidal wave. The sound echoed across the plain, carrying with it the promise of a new dawn. The kings stood resolute, their eyes burning with the fire of their purpose. They had returned, not as rulers, but as guardians, as protectors of a people who had endured so much. The night stretched on, filled with the light of the otherworld and the songs of the living. The kings stood watch, their presence a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was hope. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, it was clear that the world had changed. The land, the people, and the very spirit of the Celts had been rekindled, their strength born anew in the presence of their resurrected heroes. The night was heavy with silence, a silence so profound it seemed to hum with hidden truths. Beneath the ancient oak trees, their twisted roots gripping the earth like gnarled hands, the air shimmered with an energy unseen but deeply felt. The druids spoke in low tones, their voices blending with the crackle of the sacred fire. They whispered of the dead, not in mourning, but in reverence. For the dead were not gone, they were not silent. They were waiting. The stories told of warriors who had fallen with honor, their blood seeping into the soil, binding them forever to the land they had fought to protect. death was not an end for them, it was a passage, a bridge to another plane where they sharpened their swords, readied their shields, and awaited the call to battle once more. In the other world, where the rivers glowed with silver light and the skies pulsed with a soft, unearthly hue, these heroes prepared for wars yet to come. A faint wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of wild thyme and the distant echo of a battle horn. The living could not hear it, but the Druids, attuned to the whispers of the unseen, felt its resonance in their very bones. They knew that when the horn sounded again, it would not be a memory, it would be a summons. In the other world, the dead warriors stood as sentinels, their eyes burning with the light of knowledge only the departed could possess. They did not rest as mortals understood rest, their spirits moved like the tides, drawn to places where the veil between worlds was thinnest. There, they watched over the living, unseen but ever present. Some called them ghosts, others guardians, but they were more than that. They were the protectors of destiny, the silent architects of battles yet to be fought. One such warrior, a figure cloaked in shadows and starlight, walked the plains of the other world with purpose. His name had been lost to time, but his deeds were etched into the hearts of his people. He had fallen in a battle that turned the tide of history, his body broken but his spirit unyielding. Now, he carried a sword forged from the fire of a dying star, its blade humming with an energy that could cleave the fabric of worlds. He was not alone. Around him stood others, their faces marked with the scars of countless battles, their hands steady as they gripped weapons that shimmered with power. These warriors were bound not just to the other world but to the living world as well. They could feel the cries of their descendants, the pulse of their struggles. Each tear shed, each blood-soaked battlefield, resonated within them. They were tethered to the land, to its rivers and hills, its forests and stone circles. The living might call upon them with prayers or rituals, but it was the land itself that summoned them when the balance tipped too far toward chaos. The other world was not a place of endless peace, it was a realm of preparation, a staging ground for a war that spanned lifetimes. The warriors trained endlessly, their movements swift and precise, their minds honed to a razor's edge. They sparred under skies that burned with the light of 1,000 suns, their strikes echoing like thunder. They knew that their time would come, that the living would need them again. One night, as the stars in the other world blazed brighter than ever before, the veil between worlds began to ripple. The warriors paused, their gazes turning toward the horizon. A great shadow loomed there, a darkness that threatened to consume everything in its path. It was not just a battle that awaited them, it was a reckoning. The cries of the living reached them, faint but desperate, and the warriors felt the pull of their duty. The Druids, gathered in the sacred grove, sensed the shift. They raised their hands to the sky, chanting in a language older than time, their voices trembling with urgency. They called upon the ancestors, invoking their names and deeds, their voices a bridge between the worlds. The flames of the sacred fire leapt higher, casting shadows that danced like spirits. And then, as if carried by the wind itself, the warriors of the other world stepped forward. They did not walk as the living did, they moved like a storm, their forms shimmering with the light of the other world. Their presence was both awe-inspiring and humbling, a reminder of the weight of their sacrifice and the depth of their love for their people. The living fell to their knees, not in fear, but in gratitude. The warriors did not speak, for words were unnecessary. Their purpose was clear. The battle that followed was unlike any before it. The living fought with a ferocity born of desperation, their swords flashing in the firelight. Beside them stood the dead, their forms flickering like flames, their weapons cutting through the enemy with unrelenting precision. It was a dance of life and death, a testament to the unbreakable bond between the two. The living and the dead moved as one, their hearts beating in unison, their spirits entwined. As the first rays of dawn broke over the battlefield, the enemy was vanquished. The dead warriors stood amidst the carnage, their forms fading as the veil began to close. They turned their glowing eyes toward the living, their expressions a mixture of pride and sorrow. They had fulfilled their duty, but their time in the world of the living was fleeting. With a final, solemn nod, they returned to the other world, their presence lingering like the echo of a song. The living stood in silence, their swords lowered, their faces wet with tears. They knew they had not fought alone, that the strength of their ancestors had carried them through. The Druids whispered words of thanks, their voices trembling with emotion. The sacred fire burned low, its embers glowing like the eyes of the departed warriors. In the days that followed, the people spoke of what they had seen. They built cairns and carved stones, their hands working with reverence as they honored the dead. They knew that the warriors were not gone, not truly. They were watching, waiting, their swords ever sharp, their spirits ever ready. For the Celtic heroes, death was not an end. It was a transformation, a passage to a place where they could continue to protect and guide. They were the guardians of the future, the silent sentinels of hope. And when the world called upon them again, they would answer, as they always had, with courage and honor. The wind howled across the battlefield, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of blood and the acrid smoke of burning wood. Beneath the gray, unyielding sky, two armies stood poised. The Celts, fierce and untamed, their faces painted with the symbols of their ancestors, stared across the plain at the Romans, a wall of disciplined soldiers encased in gleaming armor. It was a clash of worlds, a collision of two forces that could not coexist. A moment of eerie silence hung between them, stretched taut like the string of a bow. The Celts tightened their grips on their weapons, long swords that glinted wickedly, spears worn smooth by countless battles, and shields marked with the scars of old wars. Beside them, Druids raised their hands, chanting incantations in voices that cut through the cold air like a blade. The Romans, stoic and silent, waited for the signal. Their formation was precise, their shields locked together, a moving fortress that seemed invincible. It began with a single cry, a roar that ripped through the silence and ignited the hearts of the Celtic warriors. They surged forward, a tide of fury and fire. The earth trembled beneath their charge, their battle cries rising like a storm. The Romans responded in kind, their disciplined ranks advancing with unyielding determination. The clash was thunderous, the sound of metal on metal, the shouts of warriors, and the screams of the wounded filling the air. The Celts fought with a wild, unrelenting passion. Their chieftains led from the front, their courage unmatched. One of them, a towering figure draped in a wolfskin cloak, swung his sword with a force that sent Roman shields splintering. He roared like the beast he wore, his eyes blazing with defiance. Behind him, warriors fought like men possessed, their movements a blur of strength and skill. The Romans countered with precision. They moved as one, their shields forming impenetrable walls, their swords darting out like the sting of a snake. Their centurions barked orders, their voices cutting through the chaos, directing their soldiers with a calm efficiency that seemed almost inhuman. They pushed forward, step by step, their line unbroken, their resolve unshaken. The battlefield became a sea of chaos. Men fell, their cries swallowed by the cacophony of war. Blood soaked the earth, turning it dark and sticky beneath their feet. The Celts Druids continued their chants, their voices rising above the din, invoking the spirits of the land, the ancestors, the gods. But the Romans, relentless and unyielding, pressed on. Their war machines hurled boulders and fire, their archers rained death from above. In the heart of the melee, a young Celtic warrior found himself face to face with a Roman soldier. The boy was no older than 18, his face smeared with paint, his hands trembling as he gripped his sword. The Roman, older and battle-hardened, raised his blade, his eyes unreadable beneath his helmet. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The boy's heart pounded, his fear and determination warring within him. Then, with a cry that was equal parts terror and courage, he lunged. The Roman parried, his movements fluid and practiced. They danced the deadly dance of battle, each strike and counterstrike a testament to their will to survive. Elsewhere on the field, the wolf-cloaked chieftain rallied his warriors. He stood atop a rise, his sword raised high, his voice booming over the clash of steel. "We are the sons and daughters of the land," he roared. "The blood of our ancestors flows in our veins. Fight, my brothers and sisters. Fight for all that we are." His words were a spark, igniting the hearts of his people. They surged forward with renewed vigor, their cries piercing the air like 1,000 arrows. But the Romans were not easily broken. They regrouped, their formations tightening, their resolve hardening. They pushed back, their shields a wall of iron, their swords cutting through the Celtic ranks. The tide began to turn. The Celts, fierce as they were, began to falter under the relentless assault. Their lines wavered, their warriors falling one by one. The wolf-cloaked chieftain, bloodied but unbowed, fought on. His sword was heavy in his hand, his breath ragged, but his spirit burned as fiercely as ever. He knew they were losing, but he would not yield. He would fight until his last breath, for to him, surrender was worse than death. As he swung his sword in a final, defiant arc, a Roman spear found its mark. He fell to his knees, the world spinning around him. His warriors cried out, their grief and rage echoing across the battlefield. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the battle came to its brutal end. The Romans stood victorious, their ranks bloodied but unbroken. The Celts, proud and fierce, lay scattered across the field, their bodies a testament to their unyielding courage. The wolf-cloaked chieftain's lifeless form was carried from the field by his surviving warriors, their faces etched with sorrow. The Romans did not cheer. There was no triumph in their eyes, only the grim satisfaction of another battle won. They gathered their dead, their faces somber as they prepared for the next war. For even in victory, they knew the price of conquest. The battlefield, once alive with the fury of battle, was now silent save for the whispers of the wind. The earth, soaked with blood, seemed to mourn the loss of so many lives. The stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, their light cold and distant, indifferent to the struggles of men. In the hearts of the Celtic survivors, the fire of resistance still burned. They had lost the battle, but their spirit was far from broken. They carried the memory of their fallen chieftains and warriors, their sacrifices a source of strength. The Romans might have won the day, but the Celts would endure. They were the people of the land, and as long as the land existed, so too would their spirit. In the quiet of the night, a lone druid knelt on the battlefield, his hands pressed to the blood-soaked earth. He whispered words of power, of remembrance, of hope. The spirits of the fallen stirred, their presence a faint shimmer in the air. They were not gone, not truly. They lived on in the hearts of their people, in the land they had fought to protect, in the unyielding spirit of the Celts. The air was still, heavy with the weight of a world on the brink of transformation. A lone monk, clad in a simple robe, stood in the center of a weathered stone circle. His voice, quiet yet firm, carried the words of a new faith, a faith that promised salvation and peace. Around him, warriors, their faces marked with the paint of ancient rites, listened with eyes that held both curiosity and caution. The clash of swords and the roar of battle that once defined their lives now seemed distant, muffled by the sound of his prayer. This was not a battlefield of blood and iron, but of hearts and beliefs. Christianity, with its promise of eternal life, had begun to weave its way into the Celtic world, reshaping the spirit of warfare itself. The warriors, who had long fought under the blessings of druids and the names of their many gods, now grappled with a faith that spoke of turning the other cheek, of loving one's enemies, and of finding strength in sacrifice. But the old ways did not fade without a fight. On the eve of a great battle, a chieftain knelt before the fire, his sword laid across his knees. The priest, a quiet man with eyes that seemed to hold a depth of understanding, stood beside him, offering a prayer to the Christian God. The chieftain's hands trembled as he whispered, "Will this God guide my sword? Will he stand with me in battle?" The priest's reply was soft yet unwavering. "He will not guide your sword, but he will guide your heart. Fight not for glory, but for the protection of your people. Fight with honor, not hate." When dawn broke, the battlefield was a place where old and new collided. Warriors with crosses carved into their shields stood beside those who bore the spirals of their ancestors. The chants of druids mingled with the solemn prayers of priests. There was no clarity, no simple answer to the conflict within their hearts. And yet, as the first war cry echoed across the hills, they charged together, their differences momentarily forgotten in the heat of battle. The influence of Christianity did not soften the Celts' fierce spirit, but it began to shape the way they understood their struggle. Where once they fought for the glory of gods who demanded blood, now some warriors fought for the salvation of their souls. Acts of mercy began to emerge on the battlefield. A wounded enemy, left vulnerable in the chaos, might find a hand extended in aid rather than a blade brought down in judgment. These moments were rare and often met with suspicion, but they were seeds of change. In one such battle, a young warrior found himself trapped, his leg pinned beneath a fallen horse. His enemy, a man twice his age with a face scarred by countless battles, stood over him. The older warrior's blade hovered for a breathless moment before it was lowered. "Go home to your family," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. The young man, too stunned to speak, could only nod. The older warrior turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy with the weight of his choice. Such moments were not spoken of in the drinking halls, but they lingered in the minds of those who witnessed them. The Druids, once the spiritual backbone of Celtic warfare, found their influence waning. They stood on the edges of battles, their voices drowned out by the growing presence of priests who blessed warriors in the name of the Christian God. Some Druids resisted, clinging to their traditions with a defiance as fierce as any warrior's charge. Others, seeing the tides of change, chose to adapt, weaving Christian teachings into their own practices. The lines blurred, and the warriors found themselves caught between two worlds, fighting not only their enemies but the very transformation of their identity. In the quiet aftermath of battles, the rituals of mourning also began to shift. The wailing songs for the dead, once a tribute to their journey to the other world, were joined by prayers for the peace of their souls. Graves were marked with crosses instead of standing stones, and the stories of the fallen spoke not only of their deeds in life but of the hope for their eternal rest. Families gathered to hear priests speak of a paradise beyond this world, a promise that softened the sting of loss, even as it raised questions about the old beliefs that had guided them for generations. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of fire, a chieftain stood before his people. In his hand, he held a sword engraved with the symbols of his ancestors, a blade that had seen countless battles. In his other hand, he held a simple wooden cross. "This is our heritage," he said, lifting the sword. "And this is our hope," he added, raising the cross. "We are warriors, born of the land and the blood of our kin. But we are also more. We fight not for gods who demand sacrifice, but for the lives of those we love. Let us honor both the past and the future." The crowd was silent, their faces shadowed in the fading light. Some nodded, their hearts stirred by his words. Others looked away, their expressions heavy with doubt and fear. Change, after all, is never easy. It demands the surrender of what was, the embrace of what could be, and the courage to step into the unknown. The battles continued, but they were no longer the same. The warriors who fought them carried not just swords and shields, but the weight of a transformation that reached into their very souls. They were Celts, fierce and proud, yet they were also something new. Christianity did not erase their identity, it reshaped it, carving new paths through the old ways like a river cutting through rock. The warriors who knelt in prayer before battle, the druids who whispered both ancient spells and Christian blessings, the chieftains who spoke of honor and mercy, they were all part of a story that was still being written. The fires of war burned on, but in their light, the Celts began to glimpse a different kind of strength. It was not the strength of swords or the power of gods demanding blood. It was the strength of a faith that spoke of love in the face of hate, of hope in the shadow of despair, and of a world where even the fiercest warrior could lay down his blade and find peace. The sun hung low over the rolling hills, casting a golden glow that stretched across the Celtic lands like a farewell. There was a strange stillness, as if the earth itself held its breath. The once thriving villages, where laughter and music once danced through the air, now lay quiet. The great halls of kings, where oaths of loyalty and tales of heroism had echoed, stood withered and worn, their fires cold. Shadows crept across the land, a silent harbinger of what was to come. A lone figure stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea. His hair, streaked with silver, caught the dying light as he gazed at the horizon. He was a bard, the keeper of stories, the voice of a people whose spirit was beginning to fracture. His harp lay silent beside him, its strings untuned, as if it, too, mourned. "What is a song," he whispered to the wind, "when there are no warriors left to hear it? The Celts, once a force of unmatched power and unity, were fading. Their golden age, a time of unmatched culture, strength, and resilience, had begun to crumble beneath the weight of relentless enemies and the slow erosion of their traditions. Kingdoms that had once thrived on the bonds of kinship now splintered under the strain of foreign invaders and internal discord. It was not a single battle that marked their fall, but a slow, aching unraveling. In a small village, a mother knelt beside her child, wrapping a thin blanket around him as the first frost of winter kissed the ground. She sang softly, her voice carrying the old words of a lullaby that had been passed down through generations. But her eyes betrayed her fear. The harvest had been meager, and the Roman taxes weighed heavily. The fields that once yielded plenty were now barren, not from neglect, but from years of warfare that had drained the strength of the people. "We will endure," she whispered, though her voice trembled with doubt. The Druids, once revered as the spiritual leaders and protectors of the people, had been hunted into hiding. Their sacred groves were cut down, their rituals suppressed by the rising power of Rome and the growing influence of Christianity. Those who remained spoke in hushed tones, their teachings preserved in fragments shared only with the most trusted. One elder, his face lined with the weight of years, whispered to his apprentice, "The trees remember. Even if we are silenced, the land will hold our stories." In the great halls, the kings who once commanded vast armies now sat with heavy hearts. Their warriors were fewer, their strength sapped by years of fighting. Yet they wore their crowns with dignity, refusing to let their people see the cracks in their resolve. One king, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, looked out over his dwindling court. "We are not defeated," he said, though the words felt hollow. "As long as we draw breath, the spirit of our people lives on." But the spirit of the Celts was not so easily extinguished. Even in their darkest hour, they fought with a ferocity that left their enemies in awe. In one battle, a small band of warriors faced a Roman legion. Outnumbered and outmatched, they stood their ground, their war cries echoing across the valley. They knew they would not see the sunrise, but they fought not for victory, but for the honor of their ancestors. When the last warrior fell, his body broken but his spirit unyielding, the Romans paused, struck by the sheer defiance of their foes. The fall of the Celts was not merely the loss of territory or power, it was the loss of a way of life. The festivals that once celebrated the changing seasons grew quieter. The vibrant markets where artisans displayed their wares became sparse. The intricate knotwork that adorned their jewelry and weapons began to fade, replaced by simpler, more utilitarian designs. The Celts were not conquered in a single moment, but eroded over generations, their culture slipping away like sand through an hourglass. Yet even in their decline, the Celts left an indelible mark on the world. Their stories, carried on the lips of bards, spread far beyond their borders. Their warriors, even in defeat, inspired legends. Their spirit, fierce and unyielding, became a beacon for those who longed for freedom. And in the quiet places of the land, where the wind whispered through ancient stone circles and the rivers carved their eternal paths, the echoes of their golden age lingered. The bard on the cliff, his heart heavy with the weight of his people's sorrow, picked up his harp. His fingers, though stiff with age, found the strings, and a melody began to rise. It was not a song of mourning but of memory. It spoke of heroes and kings, of battles fought and loved ones lost. It carried the essence of the Celts, their strength, their beauty, their defiance. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the bard's song carried on the wind, a reminder that even in the face of loss, the spirit of the Celts would endure. The battlefield was silent now, the echoes of war reduced to whispers carried on the wind. Beneath the open sky, where the sun's rays pierced through scattered clouds, lay a land that had once been drenched in blood and tears. The earth bore the scars of countless struggles, each one carving its mark into history. But this silence was not one of peace, it was a silence charged with the weight of what had come before, a silence that held stories too powerful to be forgotten. The Celts were warriors unlike any the world had seen, their battles not just clashes of swords and shields, but roaring declarations of identity and defiance. They did not fight merely to conquer, they fought to protect their way of life, their kin, and the sacred traditions that bound them to the land. Each blow struck, each life lost, became a thread in the vast tapestry of their legacy, weaving a story that would shape the world long after their golden age had passed. Among the greatest of these battles was the stand of the Gauls against the might of Rome. It was a time when the strength of the Celtic tribes was tested against an empire that sought to extinguish their fire. The fields of Elysium bore witness to a hero whose name would echo through eternity, Vercingetorix. His defiance against Julius Caesar was a symbol of hope, his determination an unyielding flame in the face of overwhelming odds. Even as the siege tightened and hunger gnawed at the resolve of his people, Vercingetorix stood unbroken, his spirit a reminder of what it meant to be Celtic. Though the battle was lost, the courage displayed by the Celts was never forgotten. The Romans themselves, who prided themselves on their discipline and strategy, spoke with awe of the ferocity and unity of the tribes. It was said that even in defeat, the Celts commanded respect, their presence lingering like the haunting notes of a dirge. Far to the west, the warriors of Britannia waged their own battles against oppression. Boudica, a queen wronged and a mother avenged, led her people in a rebellion that shook the Roman grip on the island. Her chariot, drawn by horses as wild as the storm in her heart, thundered across the fields of battle. She fought not only for freedom but for the dignity of her people, a rallying cry that would inspire generations. Even when the final confrontation ended in heartbreak, her story endured, a testament to the power of resilience and the price of resistance. The battles of the Celts were not confined to grand sieges or heroic rebellions. They fought within themselves, tribe against tribe, kingdom against kingdom, in a constant struggle to define their place in a changing world. Yet even in their conflicts, there was a strange beauty, a raw expression of loyalty and passion that spoke to their indomitable spirit. Warriors clad in intricate armor, adorned with symbols of their clans, met each other in combat with both fury and respect. It was a paradox, their unity fractured, yet their identity unshaken. Their legacy was not one of conquest, but of inspiration. The Celts left behind more than tales of battles, they left an unquenchable thirst for freedom and a deep connection to the land. Their influence seeped into the very soil of the places they touched, shaping the cultures that would rise after them. The music of the Highlands, the intricate knotwork of Celtic art, the myths of heroes who defied gods and fate, all of it carried the echoes of their struggles and triumphs. In the dim glow of the hearth, storytellers kept the spirit of the warriors alive. They spoke of Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, who stood alone against armies, driven by honor and destiny. They sang of the Fianna, bands of warriors who roamed the land in pursuit of justice and glory. These stories were more than entertainment, they were lessons, reminders of what it meant to be courageous, loyal, and unyielding. As centuries passed, the influence of the Celts spread far and wide. Their battles, once fought with swords and spears, transformed into battles of culture and identity. The resilience of their spirit found its way into the hearts of those who yearned for freedom, inspiring movements and revolutions. In the hills of Scotland, the valleys of Ireland, and the plains of Gaul, the whispers of the Celtic warriors lingered, guiding those who walked in their footsteps. Even now, when the world seems far removed from the age of warriors and kings, the legacy of the Celts endures. It lives in the rhythm of a drumbeat, echoing the heart of a warrior preparing for battle. It lives in the intricate weave of a tapestry, telling a story of struggle and triumph. It lives in the quiet moments of reflection, when the soul feels the weight of history and the call to honor those who came before. The silence of the battlefield is never truly silent. It hums with the energy of what has been and the promise of what will come. The Celts may no longer stand with swords drawn, but their battles have shaped the world in ways that cannot be undone. Their legacy is not a relic of the past, but a living force, a reminder that the spirit of defiance and the will to fight for what is right will never fade. The clash of swords echoed through the misty valleys, a sound that seemed to defy time itself. In those fleeting moments before dawn, when the world hovered between darkness and light, warriors prepared for battles not of this earth but of legend. These were not ordinary struggles, they were tests of character, trials that would decide the fate of heroes and kings. Each swing of the blade, each cry of defiance, carried the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. In the heart of Celtic mythology, battles were never just about blood and steel, they were about the soul. Every conflict was laced with a deeper meaning, a reflection of the eternal struggle between order and chaos, light and darkness, life and death. At the center of these tales stood heroes whose victories and defeats shaped the very fabric of existence. Their stories burned with raw emotion, their lessons etched into the minds of those who dared to listen. Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, stood alone on a battlefield stained with the dreams of the fallen. His enemies swarmed around him, yet he did not falter. His rage burned brighter than the flames of war, a fire fueled by loyalty and unyielding determination. When the Morrigan, the goddess of fate and battle, appeared in her many forms to test him, he fought on, even as his body broke under the strain. The pain meant nothing, his purpose meant everything. His struggle was not just for Ulster, but for the idea that one man's courage could hold back the tides of destruction. The Fianna, bands of warriors bound by a code of honor, roamed the forests and hills in search of purpose. Their battles were not always with mortal foes, sometimes they fought forces beyond comprehension. When Finn Mac Cumhaill faced Aelin, the fire-breathing destroyer of Tara, it was not brute strength that saved him but his wit and resilience. A single magical spear, wielded with precision and courage, became a symbol of hope against the overwhelming power of chaos. Through their battles, the Fianna taught that wisdom could stand alongside strength, and loyalty could be as sharp as any blade. Yet even the greatest heroes faced choices that tested the core of their being. In the tale of the children of Lyre, a father's love clashed with a stepmother's cruelty, and the resulting curse turned his children into swans. Their plight became a haunting melody that echoed through the ages, a reminder that some battles are fought with the heart, not the sword. Their endurance through centuries of sorrow spoke of a strength that transcended the physical, a lesson in perseverance and love's ability to outlast even the harshest trials. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the fabled race of gods and warriors, embodied the eternal struggle between the forces of creation and destruction. When they faced the Fomorians, a monstrous race intent on annihilation, it was not just a clash of armies but of ideals. The Dagda, with his cauldron of plenty, and Luff, with his unerring spear, stood as symbols of renewal and protection. Their victory was not absolute, it came at a great cost. Yet their resilience, their willingness to rise after each fall, taught that the struggle itself was what gave life meaning. In the quiet moments after the battles, when the smoke cleared and the cries of the wounded faded into silence, the lessons of these struggles lingered. The stories reminded those who listened that life itself is a battlefield, filled with challenges that demand courage, wisdom, and heart. The heroes of Celtic mythology did not fight for glory or conquest, they fought for the people they loved, for the land that gave them life, and for the ideals that made them whole. There was beauty in the chaos, a strange harmony in the struggle. The Celtic belief in cycles, the eternal return of life, death, and rebirth, meant that no battle was truly the end. Each struggle paved the way for new beginnings, each hero's fall planting the seeds of hope for future generations. The Morrigan, with her prophecies of doom, was not just a harbinger of death, but also a reminder that every end carries the promise of a new story. These myths were not just entertainment for long winter nights, they were guides for those who sought to understand the human condition. They spoke to the warrior in every soul, the part of each person that must face fears, confront hardships, and find the strength to keep going. They taught that true heroism is not about never falling but about rising again, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The lessons of Celtic mythology live on, woven into the hearts of those who find inspiration in the struggles of these ancient heroes. Their battles may have been fought in a distant past, but the echoes of their courage resonate in every challenge faced today. They remind us that the fight is never in vain, that every act of bravery, no matter how small, contributes to a greater story. In the end, it is not the victories or defeats that define the heroes of Celtic mythology but the unyielding spirit with which they faced their trials. Their stories remind us that the eternal struggle is not a curse but a gift, a chance to prove what we are capable of, to rise above our limitations, and to leave behind a legacy that inspires those who come after. Their battles were never truly over, and perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all.